Somewhere out there, past the last town you would recognize on a map, past the last sealed road, past the last fence post rusting quietly in the heat, there is a silence so complete that it stops being just an absence of sound. It becomes something with weight, something with texture. The Australian outback at night is not empty. It breathes. It radiates warmth from the day just ended. It holds, somewhere in its red soil and ancient stone, more mystery per square kilometre than almost anywhere else on the surface of this planet. And tonight we are going to move through it slowly. We are going to let our eyes adjust to the dark and look at the things that do not have easy explanations, the things that scientists argue about in journals and archaeologists dream about in their offices far away. The things that were left behind by people who lived here for longer than civilization has existed anywhere else on Earth, and also the things that arrived from elsewhere, from the sky, from the sea, from the margins of recorded history, and settled into the red dust and waited to be understood. You're going to hear 55 of these things tonight, each one stranger than the last, each one sitting in that particular space between what we know and what we suspect, between what the maps say and what the ground says when you put your ear against it and listen very carefully. The continent of Australia is old in a way that makes most of the world look recent. The rock formations that underlie the outback are among the most ancient exposed geology on Earth. Some of them crystallized from magma before complex multicellular life existed anywhere on the planet. The Aboriginal peoples who have lived here for at minimum 65,000 years, and by some estimates considerably longer, carry in their oral traditions and their art and their ceremony a record that makes the entirety of written history look like a rough first draft of something much larger. When you add to all of this the strange physics of an interior continent with almost no surface water, extreme heat ranges from cold desert nights to scorching days, total isolation from most forms of modern disturbance, and a night sky unpolluted by any artificial light for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, you get conditions where the mysterious does not simply exist. It accumulates, it stratifies, it waits in the rock and the sand and the dry creek beds for someone patient enough to sit still and pay attention. So let yourself settle in. Let your breathing slow and deepen. You do not need to hold any of this tightly or manage it or resolve it. Just let it move through you the way a breeze comes down off a redstone ridge in the last hour before dawn, carrying with it the smell of dust and dry grass and something older, something that has no name in any modern language, that the country gives off when nothing is moving and everything's listening. If this kind of slow, strange, unhurried journey through the hidden history of the world is something that feeds you, then stay with this channel. Subscribe now and press the bell so that these journeys find you when they are ready. We go deep, we go slow. We follow the questions all the way down, even when the answers are a long time coming. Number 1. The Marri Man. In June of 1998, a pilot conducting a light aircraft charter flight over the remote gibber plains of South Australia in the vast flat country north of the small outback town of Murray looked down through his windscreen and saw something that should not have been there. Carved into the red and ochre earth below him, visible in its entirety only from the air, was a figure. A man holding a throwing stick, or perhaps a woomera, raised above his head in a posture of motion and power, captured in a single moment, a single gesture, encoded in the surface of the earth at a scale that defied every ordinary intuition about what a single human figure should look like. The pilot circled. He looked again. He reported what he had seen. The figure measured approximately 4.2 kilometers from the top of the raised implement to the lowest point of the feet. If you laid this figure against a familiar landscape, the head would be in one suburb and the feet in another. The line itself, the groove scraped or pressed into the surface of the gibber plane, was about 35 centimeters wide and between 20 and 30 centimeters deep in the sections where it was best preserved. The total length of the line, if you could straighten every curve and segment and lay it end to end in a single straight stroke, would exceed 28 kilometers. To create this figure, whoever made it displaced more than 1/3 kilograms of rock and soil. They did this in one of the most sparsely populated regions of one of the most sparsely populated countries on Earth, and they did it without anyone noticing. The mystery does not begin with the discovery. The mystery begins with the creation. In the days after the figure was identified and reported and photographed and studied from the air, no one came forward to claim responsibility. No survey team emerged. No artist appeared with a press release explaining their materials and methods. The Marri Man arrived in the public consciousness without an author. And while there was no shortage of theories, none of them has ever been confirmed in a way that the mystery can be considered closed. The theories divide broadly along lines that reflect deeper assumptions about what is possible. One school holds that the figure was made by an American, pointing to stylistic details in the depiction of the figure that do not correspond to traditional Aboriginal representations of the human form, and to a series of small metal plaques that appeared in the area in the weeks after discovery, placed by someone who clearly knew about the figure before it became public, and which contained references to an American artist associated with large-scale earthworks. Another theory holds that the figure was made by Aboriginal community members as a statement of cultural presence and survival, a deliberate assertion that this land is known and claimed and inhabited by its traditional custodians in ways that only the sky can see. A third persistent theory, discussed by people in the local area with some degree of seriousness, is that the figure required heavy machinery and military-grade navigation technology to create at this scale and precision, and that whoever commissioned it had access to resources and organizational capacity that places the likely author in the category of an institution rather than an individual. None of these theories has evidence sufficient to be conclusive. What is known is this: the figure exists. Its surface has been partially eroded by decades of wind and rain since its discovery, the edges of the groove softening and filling in the way that everything in the gibber eventually does. But the essential form is still there, still visible from the air. The married man is still walking, still raising his throwing stick above his head, still refusing to say who put him there and why. The gibber plane absorbs the heat of each passing day and gives it back at night and does not comment. Number 2. The Gosford Glyphs. In the Brisbane Water National Park near Gosford, on the central coast of New South Wales, there is a sheltered sandstone ledge in the bush where hundreds of carvings cover the rock face in dense, organized columns. Rock art on the sandstone of the Sydney Basin is common and has been studied for many decades. The region is rich in Aboriginal engravings, pecked and ground into the sandstone in styles and subjects that are well understood within the broad framework of the coastal engraving tradition. But the carvings at this particular site in the Gosford bush are not in an Aboriginal engraving style. They are not in any coastal tradition. They are hieroglyphs. Specifically, they are carvings that resemble the hieroglyphic writing system of ancient Egypt, arranged in vertical columns on the rock face, accompanied by figures that bear a visual resemblance to those found in Egyptian tomb painting from approximately the 3rd and 4th millennia before the Common Era. Accompanying panels show a figure that some analysts have described as resembling the god Anubis, the jackal-headed deity associated with mummification and the transition to the afterlife. The Gosford Glyphs, as they are now universally called, have generated an argument that produces far more heat than it does light. The mainstream position, held by professional Egyptologists and archaeologists, is that the carvings are a modern hoax, created at some point in the 20th century by a person or persons with partial knowledge of ancient Egyptian script and a willingness to invest significant labor in a deception. The evidence for this position includes inconsistencies in the hieroglyphic conventions used, the mixing of stylistic elements from different historical periods of Egyptian culture that would not appear together in an authentic ancient text, characters that appear inverted or malformed in ways that suggest copying from a reference rather than fluent knowledge, and the total absence of any independent evidence of ancient Egyptian contact with the Australian continent in any form. No Egyptian artifacts have been found anywhere in Australia. No other Egyptian textual material exists in any Australian context. The hoax hypothesis, in the mainstream view, is not just plausible, but essentially certain. On the other side of the argument, and this is not a trivial side, stand researchers and enthusiasts who begin with the carvings themselves and work outward. They point to a translation, produced independently by 2 retired professional Egyptologists who examined the site, that reads the carvings as a memorial inscription left by an Egyptian naval expedition during the reign of a pharaoh from the early dynastic period of Egyptian history. According to this translation, the inscription describes an Egyptian sea voyage that brought a fleet to a distant land, the loss of several crew members, including a son of the pharaoh, his burial in a tomb beneath or near the site, and the grief of his companions. The translators noted that the script contains archaic elements consistent with an early dynastic date, which would place the carvings among the oldest surviving examples of hieroglyphic writing, predating most of the texts from which modern Egyptological knowledge was built. Walking the broader area around the site adds layers to the puzzle rather than resolving it. In the same general region, other anomalous carvings and figures have been reported. a carved figure described by its finder as resembling a Brahmin bull, carvings that some analysts describe as Phoenician characters. These additional elements either widen the hoax to an implausible scale or point toward a pre-contact contact history that the current academic framework cannot accommodate. The sandstone holds its carvings and the afternoon light moves across them, and the question remains open. Number 3. Lake Mungo. The Willandra Lakes region of western New South Wales is a place of layered and accumulating time. The lakes themselves are dry now, have been dry for approximately 15,000 years, but they were once a connected and productive system fed by the Lachlan River, and on their shores a community of human beings lived and fished and cooked and loved and buried their dead across a span of time so great that the act of grasping it requires a deliberate effort of imagination. We know this because the lunettes, the crescent-shaped dunes that built up on the downwind shores of the ancient lakes, have preserved the remains of their inhabitants with a fidelity and in a quantity that is extraordinary in the global archaeological record. In 1969, a geologist named Jim Bowler was examining the eroding lunette at Lake Mungo when he noticed bone fragments emerging from the sediment. Those fragments, collected and analyzed over the following months, turned out to be the oldest known cremated human remains anywhere in the world. The individual, now known in the scientific literature as Lake Mungo 1 or Mungo Lady, and referred to with the honorific Mungo Woman by many researchers, had been cremated, the bones crushed and burned a second time, and interred in a shallow pit in the lunette at a time that has been dated, through multiple independent methods, to approximately 40,000 years ago. The deliberate, ritualized, thermally sophisticated process of cremation was being practiced in inland Australia at a time when modern humans in Europe were still 2 or 3 times that far in the future from inventing their own mortuary traditions. Then, in 1974, Jim Bowler found a second set of remains in the same lunette. A male individual, now known as Mungo Man or Lake Mungo 3, buried approximately 42,000 years ago, with his hands folded together in his lap and his body arranged in a specific orientation, facing the setting sun according to some researchers, and his burial pit dusted with red ochre, a powdered mineral pigment that had been brought from a geological source at least 200 kilometers away from the lake. Red ochre burial is one of the earliest and most widespread indicators of symbolic thinking in the archaeological record. Evidence of a mind that understands death as something that has meaning, that the dead require something beyond simple disposal, that the transition from life to whatever comes after deserves to be marked with color and with care and with effort. Mungo Man was buried by people who thought about what death meant. They went 200 kilometers to get the right color for the grave. That is not behavior driven by instinct. It is behavior driven by something we would recognize as culture, as cosmology, as the need to do things correctly, even when the cost is significant. The Mungo remains became the center of a long and painful dispute between academic researchers and the 3 Aboriginal peoples with traditional custodianship of the Willandra Lakes region, the Parkinchi, Ngiampa, and Yuin. The remains spent decades in university storage in Canberra, far from the country in which they had rested for tens of thousands of years. In 2017, they were returned. They came home to the Lake Country in a ceremony that was, by accounts of those present, one of the more moving events in recent Australian cultural history. The bones of the oldest ritually interred humans in the world are back in their country, and the questions they raised when they were found about who came to this continent, when, and what they brought with them in the form of cultural and symbolic complexity are still alive and still genuinely open. Number 4. The Gympie Pyramid. On the outskirts of Gympie in southeastern Queensland, on a hillside that has been partly overgrown and partly quarried over the decades, and that sits in a landscape of rolling green farm country, there is a series of terraced stone formations that some researchers believe are the remains of a stepped pyramid. Not an Egyptian pyramid, and not a Mesoamerican pyramid in the popular imagination, but a stepped stone platform of a type found widely across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, built by many cultures for purposes that combined astronomical observation, religious ceremony, and the assertion of authority over a landscape. The Gympie Pyramid, if that is what it is, has been the subject of local discussion since the 19th century, when European settlers first began to clear the land on the hillside and found stone terracing that did not fit their understanding of anything the Aboriginal peoples of the region had built. The conventional explanation is sensible on its face. Italian immigrant farmers arrived in the Gympie region in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They brought with them agricultural practices from the Mediterranean tradition, including the building of stone terraces to manage hillsides for planting, prevent erosion, and create flat working surfaces on slopes that would otherwise be too steep for cultivation. Italian settlers did build terraces in Queensland. The hillside at Gympie could be nothing more than a very old terraced hillside garden, the evidence of someone's grandfather's agricultural labor, misread by later observers looking for something more dramatic. But the people who argue for a more ancient and more unusual origin point to several things that the agricultural explanation does not adequately address. They point to the scale of the stone courses in the lower sections of the structure, which seem disproportionately large and labor-intensive for the volume of agriculture the hillside could have supported. They point to alignments within the stonework that correspond to the rising and setting of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes, a precision of orientation that is difficult to explain as incidental in a structure built for farming. They point to the orientation and arrangement of certain stone elements that appear to be too deliberate in their placement to be simple terrace walls. And then there is the carved stone figure. In the 1960s, a farmer working in the area unearthed a stone carving described by those who saw it as resembling a seated figure, possibly a deity, in a style that some analysts compared to Egyptian or Hindu sacred sculpture. The figure was examined by several independent analysts before it was lost to view. Possibly broken, possibly retained in a private collection, possibly discarded by someone who had no idea of its significance. Its current location is unknown. It was never comprehensively studied by a professional archaeologist with access to proper documentation and comparative resources. So it sits in the record as a single account, a description of something seen by some people and then gone, which is exactly the kind of evidence that cannot be used to prove anything but also cannot be dismissed without the information to do so. The Gympie hillside is there. The stone formations are real. Whether they are Italian terrace walls or something older, the question has not been resolved by anyone with the authority to close it. Number 5, the Wandjina of the Kimberley. In the remote Kimberley region of northwestern Western Australia, on rock faces in caves, and on sheltered overhangs across a vast area of ancient sandstone country that extends for hundreds of thousands of square kilometers between the Indian Ocean coast and the interior desert, there are paintings of figures unlike any other tradition of rock art anywhere on Earth. The Wandjina. They look at you across thousands of years. Their eyes are large, dark and oval, outlined in black or dark red, wide with an expression that is not quite anything you can name in the vocabulary of ordinary human emotion. They have no mouths. Their heads are surrounded by halos or radiating headdresses that have provoked comparison in observers trained on European religious iconography, to a Renaissance halo, to a space helmet, to the depictions of divine or otherworldly figures across many visual traditions. Their bodies are often white and ghostly, elongated, their arms held slightly outward in a posture that seems simultaneously welcoming and other. The Wandjina are the ancestral creator beings of the Kimberley. They came from the sky and the sea and the dreaming, the creation time when the world was being made, and the ancestral forces moved through the landscape, performing the acts that gave the country its character and its law. The Wandjina traveled through the Kimberley country, and as they traveled, they did their creative work, shaping the features of the land, establishing the rules of relationship and behavior that the human communities descending from them would be bound by. When their work was complete, they entered the rock. They did not die, they did not leave. They stepped into the stone, and their images remained on the rock face as a visible record of their presence, as a channel through which their power continues to flow into the world, as a living connection between the ancestral past and the ongoing present. The sites where Wandjina images appear are not historical monuments. They are active ceremonial locations. The paintings require maintenance. If the images are allowed to fade without repainting, the Wandjina's power at that site diminishes, and with it the rainfall and the fertility of the land, and the continuation of the right order of things that the Wandjina established. This repainting tradition has been maintained by the Mwonjum peoples and other Kimberley communities into the present day, which is why the Wandjina images appear in some locations in multiple overlapping layers, later paintings refreshing and adding to earlier ones across spans of time that may reach back 17,000 years in the oldest documented examples. The non-Aboriginal world has found the Wandjina figures endlessly fascinating and has sometimes found them useful for narratives that have nothing to do with the actual meaning of the images. The visual similarities between the Wandjina and various cultural representations of extraterrestrial beings have made them a fixture in ancient astronaut discussions, a framing that the Mwandjin peoples firmly reject as a misreading that substitutes someone else's mythology for a living, complex, real tradition. The Wandjina are not aliens, they are the ancestors. These are not equivalent categories, and treating them as equivalent flattens something genuinely extraordinary into something merely convenient. What is undeniably true is that the Wandjina figures are among the most visually powerful and cosmologically rich works of sacred art produced by any human culture. They look back across 17,000 years, and they do not look away. Number 6. Lassiter's Reef. In 1930, a man named Harold Bell Lassiter arrived in Alice Springs with a story. He said he knew the location of a gold reef in the deep desert west of the town, a lode of gold-bearing quartz so rich and so extensive that it dwarfed any known gold deposit in Australia. He said he had first found it years before, perhaps as early as 1897, perhaps under different circumstances depending on which version of his account you were reading, and that he had spent years trying to mount an expedition to return to it, but had been thwarted each time by the combination of money, the difficulty of the terrain, and the simple fact that a man describing an enormous gold reef in a place where no one else had found gold is not immediately believed by investors. In 1930, finally, he found backers who were willing to stake an expedition. The party was assembled. Vehicles and supplies and personnel were organized. Lassiter went back into the desert to find his reef. He did not find it. The expedition collapsed in pieces, mechanical failures in the vehicles, personality conflicts between the members, inadequate planning for the specific conditions of the terrain they were entering. The other men turned back. Lassiter did not, or could not, or would not. He pushed on alone, first with an Afghan camel driver, then on a camel alone, then on foot into the country west of the Petermann Ranges, into one of the most remote and inhospitable landscapes on the Australian continent. He was found by Pitjantjatjara men who gave him food and shelter and tried to help him. He died in a cave in February of 1931. His diary was found near his body. In its final entries, he described finding the reef, seeing the gold in the quartz, being tantalizingly close. His body was eventually brought out and buried in Alice Springs. The reef was not brought with him because no one who came to find his body also found any gold. Lassiter's reef has never been found. Geological surveys of the relevant region have not produced anything matching what Lassiter described. Some researchers conclude that the reef never existed, that Lassiter was a self-deceiving fantasist whose story accumulated detail and credibility in the telling without ever being moored to anything real. Others note that the country he was describing is enormous, genuinely undersurveyed, and that unexpected gold deposits have been found in the broader region in the years since his death. They point out that the specific locations Lassiter described in his various accounts have never been definitively searched with modern equipment. The desert does not comment. It continues to hold its geology close, and the question of what is in the rock west of the Petermann Ranges remains, in its most interesting portions, unanswered. Number 7. The Nullarbor Tunnels. The Nullarbor Plain is one of the largest single exposures of limestone on the surface of the Earth. It stretches across southern Australia from Western Australia into South Australia for nearly 200,000 square kilometres. Flat as any large table, treeless by definition, the name Nullarbor derived from the Latin for no trees, lying like a pale plate under a sky that is often so blue and so large that it is the dominant visual experience of being in the place. And because it is limestone, and because water moves through limestone in ways it does not move through other rock types, dissolving it along fractures and bedding planes and carrying it away grain by grain and molecule by molecule over millions of years, the Nullarbor is full of caves. This is known. Cave systems under the Nullarbor have been explored by divers and cavers and have produced extraordinary fossil records, including the bones of extinct marsupial megafauna and evidence of human occupation going back thousands of years. But within the broader body of stories about Nullarbor caves, there exists a persistent subset that describes something different from the natural dissolution features that caving and diving have documented. These stories describe tunnels that are not natural, passages with walls that show evidence of working, of having been shaped by something more intentional than the chemistry of carbonic acid dissolving limestone. Passages that run in directions or maintain cross-sections or exhibit surface textures that trained cave explorers, when they encounter them, find inconsistent with natural formation processes. These accounts come from Aboriginal oral traditions in communities near the Nullarbor that have maintained knowledge of the cave systems for thousands of years. They come from early European settlers and prospectors in the 19th century, who explored caves in the region and occasionally described finding passages that seemed to them to have been made rather than formed. And they come from a small number of more recent explorers who have entered significant cave systems on the plain and found themselves in sections of passage that gave them pause. None of this constitutes confirmed evidence of artificial tunnels in any sense that would satisfy a formal archaeological assessment. No finding of this kind has been published in any peer-reviewed journal. The stories exist in a space between documented exploration and persistent local knowledge, and they have not been subjected to the kind of systematic investigation that would either confirm or eliminate them. What is unambiguously true is that the Nullarbor cave systems have not been fully explored. What is below the plain, in the full extent of its karst geology, has not been mapped. There are sinkholes that descend into darkness that no one has followed to its end. There are connections between known cave systems that have been inferred, but not confirmed by diving. The Nullarbor is, in its underground dimensions, a largely unknown world. The stories of worked passages persist because no one has gone everywhere underground to settle the question. Number 8, the Henbury meteorite craters. About 130 kilometers southwest of Alice Springs, in the flat red country of the Northern Territory, there is a field of craters, 12 of them arranged in a cluster, ranging from a few meters to about 180 meters in diameter and several meters deep, sitting in the desert as though someone had pressed their fingers into clay. They are the result of a meteorite that entered the atmosphere at high velocity between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago and fragmented in the final seconds before impact. The individual pieces striking the desert floor with enough energy to excavate these depressions and scatter iron-nickel fragments across the surrounding gibbous surface for kilometers in every direction. The iron that scattered from the impact was worked by Aboriginal people in the region for purposes that included tool use and trade, a point that tells you something about the length of the human relationship with these craters, and about the pragmatic intelligence of people who recognized useful raw material when it arrived from the sky. The craters were reported to Western Science in 1931 by a pastoralist named J.M. Mitchell, who described them to the government geologist and set off the formal investigation that confirmed their impact origin. What Western Science did not know until later, and has since taken more seriously, is how long the Arrernte people had known about the craters and what they knew about them. The Arrernte name for the site translates approximately as the place where the fire devil ran, and oral traditions associated with it describe what happened there in terms that, when analyzed by researchers familiar with both the traditional language and the physics of meteorite impact, describe a catastrophic event with remarkable fidelity. Fire from the sky, enormous concussion, the earth being struck and opened, fragments of burning material traveling outward from the point of impact. These are accurate descriptions of a meteorite airburst and multi-point impact event, preserved in oral tradition across approximately 4,000 or 5,000 years. This is increasingly recognized not as coincidence, but as evidence of something extraordinary about the capacity of oral tradition to preserve accurate information across timescales that written records have never been required to span. The Aboriginal traditions of Australia have done this repeatedly. The Henbury craters are one example. The circular depressions in the desert, visible from the air as a pattern of overlapping circles, carry in the knowledge of the people whose country this is a 4,000-year record of the day the sky broke open and came down. Standing in one of the larger craters, the earth walls rising around you, the blue sky a circle above, you can feel the scale of the event not in any intellectual way, but in the body, in the space the crater puts around you. Something very large and very fast came from out there and hit here. The crater is the record. The tradition is the record. Both of them are still accurate. Number 9. The Gwion figures. In the Kimberley, alongside and predating the Wandjina paintings in some of the sheltered overhangs and rock faces of the ancient sandstone country, there is another tradition of rock art that presents a different and, in some ways, more troubling mystery. Because unlike the Wandjina, whose origin and meaning are maintained in living cultural practice, the Gwion figures, known for a long time in the non-Aboriginal literature as the Bradshaw figures after the pastoralist Joseph Bradshaw, who described them to European audiences in 1891, are figures whose creators the Aboriginal communities of the region do not claim. When researchers asked the Kimberley peoples who had made these paintings, the consistent answer, given across multiple communities and recorded by multiple researchers over many decades, was not us. They were painted by a small bird, a species of finch, which gathered pigment with its beak and applied it to the rock face using its tail feathers as a brush. The bird painted these images. This is not a literal claim. No bird painted the Guion figures. The statement means, we did not make these. They were here before us. They belong to a time and a people and a tradition that predates our own knowledge. We cannot speak for them because they are not ours. This is a significant statement from cultures with enormously detailed records of what happened in their country and who was responsible for what. The acknowledgement that these figures are beyond the scope of their own tradition is a form of honesty that deserves to be taken seriously. The figures themselves are quite unlike the broad, symbolic totemic conventions of most Australian rock art. They are elongated and graceful and in motion, rendered with a delicacy of line that conveys the articulation of the human figure with considerable anatomical sophistication. They appear to wear elaborate headdresses and body decorations. Some of them carry objects that researchers have variously interpreted as bags, weapons, ceremonial items, or tools whose function is not recognizable in any current context. Some of them appear to be wearing tasseled garments, fringe or fiber elements on the costume that move with the figure's movement. They dance and gesture and walk in ways that suggest a tradition of art making aimed at capturing the specifics of the human form in action, rather than the symbolic representation of a human type. The age of the Guion paintings is genuinely unknown and genuinely difficult to determine. The organic pigments cannot be directly radiocarbon dated without destroying the sample. Attempts to date the wasp nests that have been built over the paintings, which give a minimum age, and other indirect methods, have produced estimates ranging from around 12,000 years to considerably more than 17,000 years for the oldest examples. If the older end of these estimates is correct, these paintings were made during the last ice age, when the sea levels were lower and the Kimberley coast looked very different, and the people of this region were living in conditions that we have almost no other evidence for, whether they were the ancestors of the current Kimberley peoples or a separate population that lived here before them and was eventually replaced or absorbed. No current evidence can determine. The figures are there and they are not speaking, which is itself a kind of message. Number 10, the Birdsville Track disappearances. The Birdsville Track runs roughly 520 kilometres from Marrie in South Australia northward to Birdsville in Queensland, cutting through country that is some of the most extreme in the Australian interior. For much of the year, it passes through a landscape where the temperature can exceed 50 degrees Celsius, where the gibberplane and the clay pans and the dry creek bed stretch to every horizon without interruption, where there is no shade, no surface water, no mobile phone coverage, no help within hundreds of kilometers. A vehicle breakdown without water and without a working communication device is a serious emergency. People have died on the Birdsville Track. People have disappeared on the Birdsville Track. The history of the route from its earliest use as a stock route in the 1870s through to the present is populated with stories of difficult journeys and some that ended badly. Most of the disappearances and deaths on the Birdsville Track have explanations that are tragic but comprehensible. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, running out of water after a breakdown, getting bogged in a clay pan and waiting too long for help, making a decision to walk that seemed reasonable in the moment and was not. The desert offers very specific and very immediate consequences for misjudgment, and the track's history reflects this with a directness that requires no mysterious explanation. Bones have been found years after a disappearance, sometimes hundreds of kilometers from where the missing person was last seen, the desert having worked its efficient chemistry on the remains in the intervening years. But there is a smaller subset of disappearances from the broader region of the track and the country around it, documented by researchers who have spent years compiling historical records of what happens to people in the Australian interior that do not fit comfortably into any of these explanations. Cases where a vehicle is found on the track in working mechanical order, with adequate supplies of water and food still present, with personal belongings in place, with no medical emergency obvious from the scene, and with the person or persons simply absent, not found anywhere nearby, not found dead within the vehicle or alongside it, not found at all, and where the track surface and the surrounding soil, carefully examined by experienced trackers, show no footprints leading away from the vehicle in any direction that can be followed for any useful distance before the trail is lost. These cases are few. They resist the scrutiny necessary to establish that they are genuinely anomalous, rather than simply unresolved. But the Aboriginal communities with the deepest traditional knowledge of the country around the Birdsville Track describe certain areas of the landscape in terms that the people who have lived there longest use to indicate places where the ordinary rules of navigation and orientation do not apply in the usual way. Not warnings about physical danger, though those exist too, but descriptions of places where it is possible to become lost in a way that is not fully explained by an error in navigation. The track passes through some of this country. The disappearances cluster in ways that the researchers who have studied them find interesting. The desert keeps its specific silences. Number 11. The Murchison Meteorite. On the morning of the 28th of September 1969, residents of the small Victorian town of Murchison were going about the early part of their day when the sky above them produced first a fireball and then a sonic boom, and then, over the next several hours, a rain of stones. Fragments of a meteorite breaking apart as it decelerated through the atmosphere, scattered across the area around the town. People went into their paddocks and their yards and their roads and collected the pieces, dark and fusion-crusted on the outside, grey and crystalline within, smelling, several witnesses noted, of something like methylated spirits, the volatile organic compounds in the stone outgassing as the rock cooled in the earthly air. Scientists arrived and collected samples. The Murchison meteorite, as it was classified, was a carbonaceous chondrite, a type of primitive meteorite that forms in the earliest period of solar system history, and preserves in its mineralogy and chemistry a record of conditions that existed before the Earth had assembled itself. In the years and decades that followed, the Murchison meteorite became one of the most studied and most scientifically significant pieces of rock in human history. The reason is what researchers found inside it. Amino acids. The Murchison meteorite contains more than 90 distinct types of amino acids, the molecular components from which proteins are constructed in every living thing on Earth. Of these 90 plus amino acids, many are the same ones used in terrestrial biochemistry. Some are amino acids found in living things. Some are amino acids not commonly found in living systems, but present in the meteorite in quantities that establish beyond doubt that amino acids can form spontaneously in space, through non-biological chemical processes, given the right conditions of temperature, radiation, and chemical composition. The meteorite also contains nuclear bases, the specific chemical components that form the information-carrying structures of DNA and RNA. It contains complex sugars. It contains, in other words, a significant fraction of the chemical inventory that life requires, assembled by purely physical and chemical processes over 4.6 billion years in the interstellar medium and the early solar system, and delivered to the Earth in a rock that fell on a Tuesday morning in a Victorian paddock. The Murchison meteorite does not prove that life came from space, but it demonstrates that the chemistry of life is not unique to Earth, that the building blocks of biology are distributed through the cosmos and would have been delivered to the early Earth by impacts like this one in quantities that matter for the question of how life began. We are, in some deep and literal chemical sense, made partly of material that came from the space between the stars. The meteorite that helped prove this landed in a paddock near a town with a population of several hundred people, and the people who collected it thought they were picking up an interesting rock. Number 12. The Great Artesian Basin. Beneath approximately 22% of the Australian continent, running under the outback of Queensland and New South Wales and South Australia and the Northern Territory, there is a body of water so enormous that it strains comparison with anything on the familiar surface of the Earth. The Great Artesian Basin holds an estimated 65,000 cubic kilometers of fresh groundwater in the pore spaces and fractures of sandstone formations buried up to 3 kilometers below the surface. It is one of the largest and deepest known groundwater systems in the world. In a continent whose interior receives almost no reliable rainfall and has almost no permanent surface water, the Great Artesian Basin is the hydrological foundation on which human and ecological life in the Australian interior has rested for as long as either has been here. The water in the basin is not from recent rainfall. The oldest water in the deepest parts of the system is estimated to be more than 2 million years old. It fell as rain on the Great Dividing Range in eastern Australia during the Pleistocene epoch, when the climate and the vegetation of the continent were different, when the megafauna were alive, and the sea levels were different, and human beings may or may not yet have arrived. That rain filtered through the rock over centuries, moving grain by grain through pores in the sandstone, and has been moving westward ever since under hydrostatic pressure at a rate of perhaps a meter or two per year. 2 million years of slow movement through stone, and now it arrives at the surface in the mound springs, those extraordinary places where geological fault lines and topographic conditions allow the pressurized water to rise naturally to the surface without pumping, creating oases in landscape that is otherwise among the driest on the continent. The mound springs themselves deserve a detailed entry in any catalogue of the strange and beautiful. They have been flowing, some of them, for at least 30,000 years without ceasing, fed by the 2 million year supply in the rock below. Around their warm, mineral-rich waters, isolated communities of plants and animals have evolved over timescales measured in hundreds of thousands of years, cut off from their nearest relatives by the surrounding desert. Dalhousie Springs in South Australia supports species of fish that exist nowhere else on Earth, evolved in genetic isolation in these specific waters across an immensity of time. These fish are the descendants of fish that lived in a Pleistocene lake system when the climate was wetter, and they have been trapped in the springs ever since as the desert dried around them, evolving separately from everything else their lineage produced. They are the living evidence of a world that used to exist and no longer does, preserved in a warm spring fed by 2 million-year-old rain. We are now about a fifth of the way through tonight's list, and you're still here, which means the strangeness is doing what strangeness does when it is allowed to accumulate slowly. Stay with it. If this channel is new to you, this is a good moment to subscribe and press the bell so that this kind of journey finds you whenever we make another one. We keep going as long as you keep listening. Number 13, The Dig Tree and the Expedition That Should Not Have Failed. In 1860 and 1861, an expedition led by Robert O'Hara Burke and William John Wills attempted the first European crossing of the Australian continent from south to north, from Melbourne to the Gulf of Carpentaria. The expedition was the most lavishly funded, most publicly anticipated, and most disastrously managed exploration project in Australian history. It was watched with enormous public interest from the moment the party left Royal Park in Melbourne on the 20th of August, 1860. The streets lined with cheering crowds, the newspapers providing daily coverage, the colony of Victoria investing in the enterprise as a matter of national prestige and scientific ambition. And it ended in a way that produced not triumph, but a series of deaths by starvation and exhaustion in country where people had been living successfully for thousands of years. Burke was not a bushman. He was a police superintendent, personally brave and physically resilient, energetic and decisive in a way that is useful in certain situations and catastrophic in others. He had no experience of the Australian interior. He pushed the expedition at a pace that exhausted both the men and the horses and the camels that had been specially imported for the journey. He made personnel decisions that alienated his most experienced officers at critical moments. He divided and subdivided the party in ways that distributed supplies and capable individuals across multiple camps, separated by hundreds of kilometers, creating a logistical problem that compounded itself at every decision point. And finally, he led a dash to the Gulf with 3 companions, Wills and 2 others, that achieved its objective and then ran out of margin on the return journey. When Burke, Wills, and one other man named John King arrived back at the depot at Cooper Creek, the main supply party under William Braw had waited there for 4 months beyond the agreed period, had run dangerously low on supplies themselves, and had departed for the south 9 hours before the returning explorers arrived. The tree at the depot had the word dig carved into its bark, and at its base were rations buried in a cache. Burke and Wills ate and rested and made the catastrophic decision not to follow Braha's track south towards civilization, but to try a different route to a station they believed was closer. They were wrong. Within weeks, both were dead, Wills in his sleeping bag in the shade of a coolabah tree, Burke shortly after. John King survived because the Yandrawanda Aboriginal people fed him and sheltered him and kept him alive until a rescue party arrived months later. The Yandrawanda are the important part of this story in the way that the official history has been slow to acknowledge. They knew this country. They had been feeding themselves from Cooper Creek and its surrounding environment for thousands of years. They knew where the food was. They knew how to find water. They knew how to process the nardoo fern that grew abundantly in the region, which required specific preparation to make its nutritional content bioavailable. Burke and Wills ate nardoo that the Yandrawanda gave them, but prepared it incorrectly, and they starved with food in their hands because they did not know how to make it feed them. The knowledge was present. The Yandrawanda offered it, and offered their help more broadly, and Burke refused sustained contact, partly from fear, and partly from the assumption that his own management of the situation was adequate. It was not adequate. The desert killed him. But his refusal to receive what was being offered made him available for killing. The dig tree still stands at Inaminko on Cooper Creek. The word dig is still visible in the bark. It is one of the most powerful historical objects in Australia, not because it commemorates exploration and adventure in the romantic tradition, but because it marks the location where a gap between what people needed and what they were willing to receive cost them their lives. The tree is still there. The creek flows past it in good seasons. The country continues. Number 14. Wave Rock. Near the small town of Hyden in the Western Australian wheat belt, about 340 kilometres southeast of Perth. A granite formation rises from the flat agricultural countryside in a curve so precisely wave-like in its profile that when you see it, you momentarily expect the stone to keep moving, to complete the motion and break across the salt lake at its base. Wave rock is approximately 14 meters high and 110 meters long, its concave face shaped by chemical weathering processes acting on the granite over such enormous timescales that the concept of that length of time requires more than a moment to hold in the mind with any stability. The vertical stripes of gray and red and brown and cream that run down the face, like the trailing patterns of a wave withdrawing across wet sand, are the deposits of mineral-rich water that has been seeping down the face for millennia, leaving thin coatings of carbonates and iron compounds along the natural drainage lines of the stone. The granite that forms wave rock crystallized from magma approximately 2.7 billion years ago. This is an age that requires calibration to grasp. The Earth itself formed 4.5 billion years ago. The rock of wave rock crystallized roughly 27 billion years before the present, in the Archean Aeon, at a time when the only life on Earth was single-celled organisms in the ocean, when the atmosphere contained no free oxygen, when the moon orbited closer and the tides were greater, and nothing, anywhere on the surface of the planet, was alive in any way a modern observer would recognize as complex. The stone absorbed those ancient days, cooled and contracted and fractured along the planes of its internal crystalline structure, and has been slowly emerging from the surrounding rock ever since, as erosion strips away the softer material that once buried it and reveals the harder granite core in increasingly larger sections. 2,700,000,000 years. When you put your hand flat against the face of wave rock and feel the texture of the crystals under your palm, you are touching something that formed when no living thing on Earth had yet developed a nucleus in its cells. The stone has been resting in this landscape in one form or another, since before any ancestor of any multicellular organism had come into existence. The wave that looks like it froze in mid-motion has been frozen for nearly 3 billion years. The Noongar people know this place and have known it across the entirety of their presence in this country. It appears in their traditions and their relationship with the land in ways that the academic literature has documented only partially. The site also has a wall at its base, built in the 20th century to capture rainwater runoff for the town of Hyden, a piece of practical infrastructure that coexists with the 2.7 billion-year-old geology in the manner of most things in Australia, the ancient and the recent sharing space without particular ceremony. Both things are there. Both things are real. The wave does not mind the concrete wall, and the concrete wall is not diminished by the wave. Number 15. The Nullarbor UFO Encounter. On the morning of the 20th of January 1988, the Knowles family was driving west along the Eyre Highway across the Nullarbor Plain, heading from Adelaide toward Perth. The family consisted of Faye Knowles, a woman in her late 40s, and her 3 adult sons, Patrick, Sean, and Wayne. They were driving in the early hours of the morning, the hour that long-haul drivers on outback roads often favor for the cooler temperatures and the absence of other traffic. The Nullarbor at that hour on the highway is one of the most complete darknesses accessible by car in Australia. The road runs through landscape so flat and so devoid of any interruption that the sky wraps all the way around you from horizon to horizon, and in the absence of other headlights, it is possible to drive for long stretches with no other light source anywhere. What the Knowles family described in statements made separately to police and journalists in the hours and days after the event was this: a bright light appeared on the road ahead of them. The light changed behavior in ways that suggested it was attached to a physical object rather than being a diffuse atmospheric phenomenon. The object came toward them. It appeared to descend and make contact with the roof of the car. The family, in the account they gave consistently across multiple interviews, described the car being lifted partially off the road surface. They described a humming vibration. They described a dark, powdery substance that appeared around the car and entered through the partially open windows. One son, Sean, stopped the vehicle at speed when the object seemed to release the car, blowing out a tire. The family pulled off the road, and the object, whatever it was gone. When police examined the car at Mundrabilla, one of the Nullabor's sparse truck stop settlements, they noted damage to the roof of the car consistent with something having gripped or pressed down on it. They noted the dark, powdery substance on the roof and in the interior. They confirmed the blowout. The family's accounts were consistent with each other across the independent interviews conducted separately. None of the four individuals had any prior history of making unusual claims or seeking public attention. They were, by all accounts, frightened and shaken, and certain that something had happened to them that they could not explain. The Nullarbor incident has never been satisfactorily explained. Ball lightning has been proposed, capable of producing unusual visual and physical effects near vehicles, though the specific physical evidence of the roof damage is not easily reconciled with any known ball lightning event. Truck encounter at speed on the dark highway, combined with disorientation and panic, has been suggested as an explanation for some elements of the account. The family has consistently rejected these explanations as inadequate to what they experienced. Whatever passed over or landed on that car on the Nullarbor in January of 1988 has not been identified to the satisfaction of the people it happened to. The Nullarbor keeps producing stories that the flat highway and the enormous dark sky witness and do not explain. Number 16. The Waipa Shell Mounds. On the western coast of Cape York Peninsula in Queensland, along the shoreline and the estuaries near the modern mining town of Waipa, there are accumulations of shells that are among the largest human-constructed features anywhere in Australia. Not buildings, not earthworks in the conventional sense, not monuments as we typically imagine them, but structures nonetheless, deliberate, sustained, multi-generational constructions in which the material is the waste product of thousands of years of meals, the discarded shells of shellfish harvested from the coastal and estuarine environment and brought to specific places where, shell upon shell, across centuries and then millennia, they accumulated into mounds that now rise several meters above the surrounding terrain and extend across areas the size of city blocks. The Waipa Mounds were known to European settlers in the region and were initially interpreted as natural features, coastal ridges formed by wave action depositing shell material on beach crests. This interpretation was not innocent of motivation. If the mounds were natural, the land on which they sat was unoccupied and available, and the people who had been living on it for thousands of years had left no mark that required acknowledgement. The natural origin interpretation was comprehensively disproven by archaeological work in the 1960s and 1970s, which established beyond doubt that the mounds were created by sustained human food processing activity over a period of at least 2,000 years and potentially considerably longer. The shells are discarded food remains. They were brought to these specific locations deliberately. The mounds grew because people kept coming back and kept processing shellfish in the same places. But the conventional characterization of the mounds as rubbish heaps, while not inaccurate in a narrow technical sense, misses the significance of what sustained, deliberate, multi-generational use of specific sites means in a community's relationship with a landscape. More recent research conducted in collaboration with the Wik and Wikway peoples, whose ancestors created the mounds and whose descendants are the traditional custodians of the country, has developed a more complex understanding. The mounds were not incidental. Their locations were chosen and maintained across generations in ways that reflect deep knowledge of the coastal ecology, the seasonal abundance of specific shellfish species, the practical advantages of particular spots for processing and cooking. The mounds are also territorial markers, landmarks, places of gathering and of return. They are, in ways that the people who know them best understand, records of relationship between a community and a coast, encoded in the medium of 10,000 years of discarded meals. Number 17. Kadithanda and the Patience of a Salt Lake. Lake Eyre, which carries its traditional name of Kadithanda, alongside the European name given by the explorer John Edward Eyre, who was directed toward it by Aboriginal guides in 1840, is the largest lake in Australia and one of the largest salt lakes in the world when it is full. The qualification when it is full is important because the lake is, for the great majority of time, not a lake at all. It is salt flat, 9,500 square kilometers of white and cream and ochre, crystallized salt lying on a bed of clay and sediment, an expanse so flat and so featureless that the curvature of the earth becomes visible at its edges, so reflective of the sky that the boundary between the lake surface and the sky above it becomes ambiguous in the middle of the day. It is the lowest point on the Australian continent, sitting about 15 meters below sea level, and nothing drains away from it. It is a closed basin. Water that arrives here has arrived at the end of all possible movement, and the only way out is evaporation. The lake fills when rainfall far to the northeast, in the catchment country of Western Queensland and southwestern Queensland, is sufficient to push water down the river systems that drain into the basin. The Diamantina and the Georgina flow from Queensland. The Cooper Creek flows from further north and east, carrying the water of storms that may have fallen 1,000 kilometers away. These rivers are themselves intermittent things, dry creek beds for long periods, and then brown, wide, spreading floods when the water comes. When they reach the Lake Eyre Basin, the water spreads across the salt surface in a wave that moves at a walking pace across the flat terrain, warm and shallow, dissolving salt into brine as it goes. The lake has filled significantly only a handful of times in the period of European observation. In 1974 and 1984, and then dramatically in 2010 and 2011, the lake filled to depths sufficient to transform the landscape completely. The transformation is one of the great ecological events on Earth. Where there was white salt and absolute silence, there is water. And within days, life arrives in quantities that seem physically impossible for a landscape that has been biologically dormant. Pelicans from coastal colonies and inland waterways hundreds of kilometers away begin arriving. Something tells them the lake has filled before any human technology has confirmed it. They come in their thousands and then their tens of thousands, white shapes moving across the sky toward a place they know about from some reservoir of memory or sensitivity that science has not fully characterized. Banded stilts arrive, silver gulls arrive, the entire basin ecology, which has been waiting in its refuges, in permanent water holes and creek pools and underground in the form of dormant seeds and resting stages of invertebrates, responds to the signal of water with an urgency that has been refined over millions of years of practice. The Arabana people, the traditional custodians of Kadithanda, understand the lake as a living entity with its own agency and its own requirements, not as a geographic feature that happens to have water in it sometimes. The Arabana relationship with the lake is maintained through ceremony and through the knowledge encoded in their traditions about the patterns of filling and drying, about the ecological responses that follow filling, about the specific qualities of the country in different states of water. This knowledge is not picturesque or metaphorical. It is practical and it is precise. The Arabana have been managing their relationship with this lake across the full range of its behavior, across cycles that include decades of dry and then sudden years of abundance for tens of thousands of years. The patience required to maintain knowledge of a place that rewards attention intermittently and unpredictably is itself a kind of intelligence. Number 18. The Devil's Marbles. Along the Stuart Highway in the Northern Territory, in flat mulga country about 100 kilometers south of Tennant Creek, there is a low, shallow valley where enormous rounded granite boulders are scattered across the landscape in a way that stops even the most hurried traveler. The Devil's Marbles, Kalu Kalu in the languages of the Warramungu and Kaiteti peoples, are boulders of all sizes, from things you could conceivably lift to monoliths that stand 4 or 5 meters high, sitting and stacking and balancing in configurations that look simultaneously improbable and permanent. Some are balanced on top of each other, in arrangements that appear to defy the physics of the situation, a large sphere resting on a smaller sphere on a narrow base of ground. Some have split cleanly in half along planes invisible until the split occurred, the two halves now lying slightly apart from each other, like an enormous egg that cracked open from within, exposing smooth grey interior surfaces where the exterior is weathered orange-red. The geology is understood and satisfying in the way that good geological explanations always are. The boulders are the exposed cores of a granite intrusion that formed underground approximately 1.7 billion years ago, when magma pushed upward into the existing rock and cooled slowly, crystallizing into the coarse-grained granite that you can see in the crystal structure of the boulders today. As the granite cooled, it contracted and cracked in systems of roughly perpendicular fractures called joints that divided the mass into irregular blocks. Over the following hundreds of millions of years, as the softer surrounding rock eroded away and the granite was gradually exposed at the surface, water penetrated the joint planes and began chemically weathering the granite, attacking the corners and edges of the original joint blocks faster than the flat faces, because more surface area is exposed at corners. Gradually, block by block, the rectangular joint blocks were rounded into the spherical and near-spherical forms we see today. The process is called spheroidal weathering, and it has been working on these boulders for so long that the original joint system is barely visible in the rounded forms that remain. 1 and 700 million years ago. The Kalu Kalu granite cooled underground before there were any animals on the land surface of Earth, before there were plants on land, before there were fish in the sea. Whatever was alive in the Archean and early Proterozoic ocean had not yet developed the cellular complexity that would eventually produce everything with a spine. The boulders sat underground through the Cambrian explosion of complex life, through the emergence of fish, through the colonization of land by plants and then animals, through the age of dinosaurs, through the asteroid impact that ended it, through the long Cenozoic diversification of mammals, and finally through the arrival of human beings in Australia. They have been sitting here in their current exposed and rounded form for somewhere between a few million and a few tens of millions of years. The Warramungu understand the Kalu Kalu as the eggs of the rainbow serpent, the ancestral being whose movements created many of the topographic features of the interior. In this reading, the boulders carry the creative force of the dreaming within them, objects left behind by a journey that cannot be fully seen from any single point because it operates at a scale commensurate with geology. The geological explanation and the ancestral explanation are not competing in the way that two competing scientific hypotheses would be. They are descriptions of the same reality from different frames of knowing. What they agree on is the scale and the patience of whatever made these things. Number 19. Coober Pedy and the Underground World. Coober Pedy sits in the South Australian desert about 850 kilometres north of Adelaide, in landscape that does not encourage prolonged surface exposure by unprotected humans. The summer temperatures regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius. There is almost no shade in the town itself because the vegetation of the region runs to sparse mulga and bluebush that offers no canopy to speak of. There is no local water source. The nearest significant town is Glendambo, about 250 kilometres south, which is itself a very small place. Coober Pedy exists because of what is in the ground under it, and because the people who came to get what was in the ground discovered that the most effective way to survive the surface conditions was to move most of their lives below the surface. The opal was found here first in 1915 by a teenager named Willie Hutchison, who was part of a gold prospecting expedition and who found, instead of gold, a vein of potch and precious opal in the red-brown sandstone. The name Coober Pedy derives from the Aboriginal term Cooper Piti, meaning white man's hole in the ground, which was applied first to the dugout shelters that the miners created and then to the settlement that grew around them. The dugout concept was simple and effective and entirely pragmatic. The sandstone that underlay the ground was soft enough to excavate by hand, and with simple tools, the ground maintained a temperature of roughly 22 degrees Celsius year-round, regardless of the surface conditions. And digging out a room was an act that sometimes produced opal from the walls as a bonus. The underground world of Coober Pedy has expanded and elaborated over more than a century of occupation into something that no longer requires apology as a makeshift adaptation to extreme conditions. There are underground homes of real elegance and considerable size, with curved ceilings and smooth walls, and furnished with all the ordinary appointments of a comfortable life, simply set below the surface of the ground. There are underground churches, including a Serbian Orthodox church of considerable beauty, and an underground bookshop and an underground hotel where guests sleep in rooms carved from the stone. The Old Timers Mine Museum preserves and displays a working opal mine and associated dugout residences from the early period of the settlement, letting visitors understand how people actually lived in the conditions of early Coober Pedy. The opal itself is the thing that draws people and keeps drawing them. Coober Pedy produces perhaps 70% of the world's supply of precious opal, the material that plays light across its surface in shifting colors that have no analog in any other natural substance. The opal forms when silica-rich groundwater seeps through sediment and fills spaces in the rock, depositing layers of silica spheres as the water evaporates. When the sphere layers are in the right size range and packed in the right arrangement, light entering the opal diffracts off the sphere array and emerges as spectral color. The colors shift as the angle of observation changes because the diffraction conditions change. Red and green and blue and gold and violet appear and disappear as you turn the stone. But sometimes the silica did not fill an empty space in the rock. Sometimes it filled the space left by something that was once alive. Sometimes the original bone or shell of an animal that died 100 million years ago, when Coober Pedy was at the bottom of an inland sea, was replaced molecule by molecule with silica spheres, and the resulting object is an opalized fossil, the perfect three-dimensional form of a prehistoric creature, rendered in the material of iridescent light. Number 20, Broken Hill and the Art of Deep Country. Broken Hill is the outermost city of New South Wales, 100 kilometres northwest of Sydney, across the Barrier Range from South Australia, in country that has the specific quality of remoteness that comes not just from distance, but from the visual character of the landscape itself, the low mulga woodland, the gibber plains, the dust, the clear dry air that makes the sky a particular shade of blue that you only see in dry inland country, a blue with no moisture in it, saturated and deep in a way that skies near the coast never quite achieve. The city grew on top of one of the richest ore deposits in the world, a body of lead, zinc and silver so enormous that it has been mined continuously since 1883 and is still not exhausted. The company that eventually evolved from the original Broken Hill mining operations, Broken Hill Proprietary, became the largest company in Australia and one of the largest in the world. And the financial flow from that ore body funded a significant portion of Australia's industrial development in the first half of the 20th century. The mining culture of Broken Hill, the union culture that developed in the harsh conditions of deep underground mining, the particular society that formed in this remote place around the extraordinary wealth beneath its feet, is its own story. But 130 kilometres to the northeast, through the Mulga and the Red Country, there is a place that the mining story does not touch and cannot account for. Mudawinchi. The national park occupies the Bignana Range and the gorge country around it, and its sheltered sandstone faces and overhangs carry one of the most significant and most moving bodies of rock art in Australia. Paintings and engravings accumulated in these locations over thousands of years by the Malyankapa and Pakanchi peoples, whose traditional country this is, and whose ancestors made these marks, and whose descendants maintain the relationship with this place in the present day. The site carries pain as well as beauty. In 1861, during the period of brutal frontier violence that accompanied the pastoral expansion into western New South Wales, a group of native mounted police killed a number of Aboriginal people who had gathered in the gorges for ceremony. The massacre happened at a place that had been sacred and inhabited for thousands of years, and it was one event in a pattern of systematic violence that was largely unreported and officially unacknowledged for much of the following century. The painting survived, the country survived. The connection between the surviving communities and their landscape was maintained through immense difficulty, through the decades of the assimilation era, through the dispersals and the removals and the policies that tried to sever what the country itself held together. In the 1980s and 1990s, Mutawinchi was returned to joint management with the traditional owners. The art on the walls and the people who know what it means are in the same place again. Number 21. The Painted Desert of South Australia. In the far north of South Australia, in the country that stretches out from the Painted Desert Conservation Reserve toward the Gibber Plains beyond Oodnadatta, the earth has done something to colour that seems to require a different category of explanation than ordinary geology usually demands. The landscape here is sedimentary, laid down over millions of years in ancient lake and river systems under conditions that change repeatedly as the climate of the Australian interior shifted between wetter and drier phases across deep time. These changing conditions produce sediments with different mineralogies and different organic contents, and those differences are preserved in the rock as differences in color, red and orange and yellow and cream and grey and ochre, and the particular brown of iron-rich clay, stacked in horizontal bands that have been tilted and eroded and exposed over millions of subsequent years, until the landscape is stripped back to reveal the colored interior of its own geological history. In the right light, the painted desert produces an effect that is difficult to describe without reaching for words that are usually reserved for art rather than geology. The early morning and the late afternoon, when the sun is low and warm and angled across the exposed strata, are the times when the colors are most intense, when the rock seems to be doing something with light that goes beyond simple reflection. The layers glow. The transitions between colors are sharp and clean in some places, and blended and gradual in others. The whole landscape looks, in those hours, like something that was arranged to be looked at, which is simultaneously obviously not what happened, and also, in a functional sense, exactly what happened. Erosion arranged this landscape, and what it arranged is spectacularly beautiful. The Aboriginal tradition in this country, belonging to the Arabana and neighbouring peoples, understands the colours and the layering as the record of ancestral activity, the physical marks left by the movements and acts of created beings in the dreaming time when the landscape was being shaped. This framework does not compete with the geological explanation. It is a different kind of account of why the landscape has the character it does. Both accounts are true to what they describe. The geological account describes the physical process. The ancestral account describes the meaning of the place, its significance in the web of relationships between land and people and law and ceremony that has sustained communities in this country for tens of thousands of years. The colors in the rock are real. Their geological origin is understood. Their significance in the living tradition of the people whose country this is goes beyond what geology can describe. Not because the geology is wrong, but because geology is not the only true language for talking about a landscape. Number 22. The Halls Creek Meteorite Crater. In 1947, a pilot flying over the Great Sandy Desert in the remote Kimberley region of Western Australia spotted something from the air that had not appeared on any map, and that was clearly not a product of any geological process that ordinary erosion and deposition could account for. A circular feature in the landscape, enormous, clearly defined, with a raised rim that projected above the surrounding terrain and an interior depressed below it. He reported what he had seen. Geologists investigated. The feature was confirmed as a meteorite impact crater, now called the Wolf Creek Crater, approximately 880 meters in diameter and about 60 meters deep from rim to floor, one of the largest and best preserved meteorite impact craters in the world. The meteorite that created it struck at some point between 300,000 and 2 million years ago, estimates varying depending on the dating method used. Its mass at impact has been estimated at approximately 50,000 tons or more. When it hit, it was traveling at perhaps 15 kilometers per second, and the energy released in the impact excavated the crater in a fraction of a second, with the force of thousands of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. The surrounding landscape was transformed by the impact blast and the ejector thrown outward from the point of contact. Fragments of the impactor, oxidized iron, have been found scattered across the gibber surface in the vicinity of the crater, some of them collected and studied and distributed to museum collections. Some of them still in the desert waiting for someone to recognize them. The Jaru people, whose country includes the crater, call it Kandimalal. Their traditions associated with the site describe both a great serpent that moved through the earth, creating the circular features it burrowed, and a star that fell from the sky. These are not competing accounts in the Jaru tradition. They are different framings of an event that can be understood from multiple angles simultaneously. The earthly and the celestial versions of the same occurrence held together without requiring resolution into a single explanation. The crater approach from across the red sand of the Great Sandy Desert reveals itself gradually as you walk toward it, the rim rising ahead of you without announcing itself dramatically at first. The scale of the feature becoming apparent only as you get close enough to realize that what you took for a low ridge is actually the raised edge of a structure that extends 880 meters from where you stand to the far side. Standing on the rim and looking down into the interior, the Salt Lake sediment that has accumulated in the floor over hundreds of thousands of years, making it white in the colors of the crater bottom. You can feel the scale of the impact not as a number, but as a space. Something enormous and fast came from the direction of the sky and arrived here. The crater is the record of the arrival. The desert has preserved it with the same patient chemistry. It preserves everything, slowly, without urgency, without any concern for whether anyone is paying attention. Number 23. Lake Disappointment. Western Australia's Lake Disappointment received its name in 1897 from the explorer Frank Hann, who followed the drainage patterns of rivers in the region, expecting to find a large, permanent lake at their terminus, as the hydrology of the country suggested, and found instead a vast salt playa, a seasonally flooded and quickly dried lake bed of salt crust and brine and clay. No permanent fresh water, no relief from the desert conditions, nothing that the expedition needed. Hann named it for the feeling and moved on. The lake sits in the Little Sandy Desert, in a remote basin that drains the country for hundreds of kilometers in several directions. It is a closed basin, meaning water that flows into it from the surrounding landscape has nowhere further to go, and evaporates, leaving behind the minerals it has dissolved from the rocks and soils of the catchment. Over geological time, this process has concentrated an extraordinary range of minerals in the lake sediments and in the brine that accumulates beneath the salt surface after significant rainfall. Iron compounds give the surface its reddish and ochre colors in different areas. Sodium and other evaporate minerals form the white salt crust, and in the brine underlying the salt surface, dissolved in the remnant water that persists below the dry-seeming surface through much of the year, there are concentrations of lithium that have attracted commercial interest in recent years. The Martu people of the Western Desert have lived with this country for thousands of years, and their relationship with Lake Disappointment has nothing of what Han's name implies. The lake is not a disappointment in the Matu tradition. It is a place with specific qualities, specific significance, specific relationships to the broader network of country that the Matu know through their law and their ceremonies and their movement through the landscape. The lake and its surrounding country are not valued because they contain fresh water or because they are easy to live in. They are valued because they are what they are, because they are part of the country that the Matu are responsible for, and that is responsible for the Matu in the reciprocal relationship between people and land that traditional custodianship maintains. Han's name stuck because European naming often does, even when it describes nothing more than the feeling of a single man on a single day who found something that was not what he was looking for. But the lake existed before Han named it, and it will exist long after everyone who knows his name has passed, in its salt and its brine and its particular shade of light in the late afternoon, indifferent to the disappointment of strangers. Number 24. Wardi Yuang and Ancient Astronomy. About 50 kilometers west of Melbourne, near the town of Little River in Victoria, there is a horseshoe-shaped arrangement of basalt stones set into a low ridge that gives a clear view of the surrounding open plain and of the western horizon where the sun goes down each evening. The arrangement is about 50 meters across at its widest point, made of stones that were not native to the immediate ridge surface, but were brought from somewhere nearby and placed in their current positions by human hands. At the western end of the horseshoe, 3 particularly large and prominent stones are positioned in a way that has attracted scientific attention. These 3 stones align precisely with the setting sun at the equinoxes and at the solstices. Additional stones within the arrangement correspond to other solar alignments across the year. Wardi Yuang, to use the name given to the site in the Wathaurong language of the traditional custodians, is an astronomical observatory, not an accidental one or a speculative one or a metaphorical one, a functioning, precise astronomical observatory whose purpose was confirmed through the combination of physical measurement and Wathaurong oral tradition. The Wathaurong elders, who worked with a University of Melbourne astronomer in documenting the site, knew what it was for. Their traditions carried the knowledge of the site's astronomical function across the generations that separate its construction from the present day. The astronomer confirmed that the alignments are real and accurate. The site encodes knowledge of the solar calendar in stone with a precision that serves practical purposes. Knowing when the equinoxes and solstices occur tells you where you are in the annual cycle of seasons, which tells you when to expect the flooding of rivers, the flowering of plants, the movement of animals. The age of Wardi Yuang is not known with certainty. The stones cannot be radiocarbon dated. Attempts to date associated organic material in the soil beneath the stones have produced results that are suggestive but not conclusive. The Wathaurong traditions describe the site as built by ancestors, which is consistent with it being pre-European contact, but does not specify a date. What can be said is this: if the site was built before European contact, which the evidence strongly suggests, and if it functioned as an astronomical observatory, which the measurements confirm, then it may be the oldest known astronomical observatory in the world, predating the famous stone monuments of Europe by a margin that has not yet been precisely determined. The possibility is not fringe speculation. It has been presented at scientific conferences and published in peer-reviewed work. Astronomy in Australia may be older than anywhere else. The science of tracking the sky may have been practiced from this ridge in Victoria at a time when the builders of Stonehenge were not yet born. Number 25, the Gorges of Karijini. The Pilbara region of Western Australia is one of the places on Earth where the geological antiquity of the Australian continent is most immediately and physically evident. The rock that underlies the Pilbara formed between 2.5 and 3.5 billion years ago, making it among the oldest surviving rock at the surface of the Earth, predating the evolution of complex multicellular life by more than 1 billion years. In the Karijini National Park, which protects a landscape of spinifex-covered plateau and sudden dramatic gorges in the iron-rich rock, you can descend from the hot surface world into narrow corridors of stone that go down 30 meters or more through walls of banded iron formation, the red and grey and black stripes of chemistry laid down 2.5 billion years ago in a Precambrian sea. The gorges of Karijini are not just visually extraordinary, though they are that in a way that photographs cannot fully communicate, because the photographs do not include the temperature change, the sound change, the smell of water and stone in dry country, the particular acoustic quality of a narrow space where water has carved the walls into organic curves. They are places where you can touch geology that is older than the evolution of complex multicellular life. You can put your hands on rock that formed when the ocean that covered this part of the world had no fish in it, no corals, no shells, nothing visible to the naked eye. The red and black banding you see in the gorge walls is the chemical signature of the Great Oxygenation Event, the moment in Earth history when photosynthetic bacteria began producing oxygen, and that oxygen began precipitating iron out of the seawater in alternating layers. The walls of Karijini's gorges are made of the aftermath of the first breath. The Banijima, Kurama, and Inawonga peoples are the traditional custodians of Karijini, and their knowledge of the gorges and the country around them goes back to the earliest period of human presence in the Pilbara, which is among the earliest in Australia, and therefore among the earliest anywhere on Earth. The gorges appear in the dreaming traditions of the custodian communities as places where ancestral events took place, where the creative forces of the dreaming interacted with the landscape in ways that gave the gorges their specific character. The geological explanation of the gorges is the product of rivers following the weakness of ancient joint plains in the rock. Cutting downward over millions of years is not in conflict with the ancestral explanation. Both are true to what they describe. The gorges are the result of water working through the weakness of ancient rock across vast time. And the gorges are the physical record of a creative force commensurate with that scale. Number 26, Thylacine. The thylacine, called the Tasmanian tiger for the dark stripes that crossed its hindquarters and lower back, and called the Tasmanian wolf in older literature for its overall body plan, which resembled a medium-sized dog more than it resembled any marsupial most people have encountered, was declared officially extinct in 1936. The last known individual was a male animal who died in the Hobart Zoo on the 7th of September 1936, in a cage on a cold night when no one was watching. He was the last confirmed member of a species that had roamed Tasmania since the dingo arrived on the Australian mainland, and outcompeted the thylacine there approximately 2,000 years ago. In Tasmania, without the dingo, the thylacine had survived the changing conditions of the Holocene and the pressures of Aboriginal hunting until European settlers arrived, declared it a threat to sheep, placed a government bounty on it, and proceeded to hunt it to the point where the last specimen died in a zoo rather than in the wild because there were no others in the wild. The extinction is not in doubt. What is in doubt, in a way that has not been entirely resolved despite decades of official certainty that the species is gone, is whether the extinction is complete. Since 1936, there have been hundreds of reported sightings of thylacine-like animals in Tasmania. These reports come from people of all backgrounds and levels of familiarity with wildlife, from experienced park rangers and professional naturalists, to tourists and farmers, and people who know what they know about animals and report what they saw. The Tasmanian government has conducted formal investigations of multiple credible reports. Camera traps have been deployed in areas where sightings cluster. Remote sensing technology has been applied, and no confirmed photographic evidence of a living thylacine has been produced. The mainland sightings are the more interesting category for purposes of this discussion. The thylacine was absent from the Australian mainland for approximately 2,000 years before its extinction in Tasmania. But reports of thylacine-like animals in remote mainland areas, particularly from the Cape York Peninsula in Queensland and from the Kimberley in Western Australia, have persisted through the 20th century and into the 21st. These mainland reports are often from Aboriginal community members and from pastoralists with long experience in the specific country where the sighting occurred, people whose familiarity with local wildlife is not limited to what appears in field guides. The descriptions are consistent: a medium-sized, striped quadrupedal carnivore with an unusual stiff-tailed gait and a wide-opening jaw. These characteristics are distinctive to the thylacine and are not shared by any other species known to be present in these areas. No mainland sighting has produced confirmed physical evidence either. No clear photograph, no confirmed track cast, no biological material identified as thylacine by genetic analysis. The absence of confirmed evidence is not the same as confirmed absence, particularly in country as vast and as poorly surveyed as the Cape York Peninsula or the Kimberley. These are enormous areas of dense, complex terrain with small resident human populations and very limited systematic survey coverage. A small, shy nocturnal carnivore would not be easy to confirm in such country, even if it were present. The question remains open, not because the evidence is strong, but because the country is large enough that the question cannot be definitively closed. Number 27. The Bungle Bungles. When a film crew flying over the East Kimberley of Western Australia in 1983 noticed a large area of unusual striped tower formations in the landscape below them and reported the observation, They were describing something that had existed in the same form for many millions of years, and that had been known to the Kija and Jaru peoples for tens of thousands of years as Pernalulu. The Bungle Bungle Range, as it became known to the wider world after the film crew's report triggered its entry into the formal records of Australian geography, and then into the World Heritage listing it received in 2003, covers approximately 450 square kilometres of the Ord River region in a landscape that is otherwise dominated by tropical savanna and pastoral country. The formations themselves are tower-shaped, roughly conical or beehive-shaped, rising to several hundred metres above the surrounding terrain in a dense forest of stone. What makes them visually extraordinary and scientifically unusual is their surface. Alternating horizontal bands of orange and dark grey or black, vivid enough in full daylight to be visible from considerable height in an aircraft, and striking enough on foot that most people who see them for the first time find it difficult to believe they are looking at a natural product of geology and biology, rather than something that was placed there with aesthetic intention. The orange bands are silica-cemented sandstone, the harder and less porous rock. The dark bands are a biological crust, a living community of cyanobacteria and algae that colonizes the surface of the more porous rock layers, where moisture is better retained after rainfall. The cyanobacteria produce dark pigments to protect themselves from ultraviolet radiation, giving the biological crust its deep charcoal color. The alternating pattern of the banding therefore reflects the alternating permeability of the original sandstone layers, which in turn reflects the conditions under which each layer was deposited in the ancient fluvial environment that built up the sedimentary sequence. The biological community reads the rock chemistry and distributes itself accordingly, and the resulting visual pattern is one of the most striking landscape features on Earth. The Pernalulu area was not unknown to non-Aboriginal people before 1983. Pastoralists had been working in the surrounding country for decades. The remoteness and inaccessibility of the range meant it was simply not on any map that circulated beyond the immediate district, and no one with the authority to add it to any official geographic or scientific inventory had been there to see it. The Kija people, for whom Pernalulu is part of the living country of their tradition, watch the processes of official discovery and documentation and heritage listing, with the complicated perspective of people watching institutions discover what they have always known was there. Number 28, the dark emu and the question of agriculture. In 2014, the Wiradjuri writer and researcher Bruce Pascoe published a book that challenged the foundational assumption underlying most non-Aboriginal understanding of Aboriginal Australian society before European contact. The foundational assumption was this, that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia were exclusively nomadic hunter-gatherers, moving through the landscape in family groups following the availability of food, with no permanent settlements, no constructed food storage, no deliberate cultivation of plants, and no practices that could be described as agriculture in any meaningful sense. This assumption had been the basis of colonial land policy, which classified the continent as essentially unoccupied and therefore available for appropriation. It had also been the received view of academic anthropology and archaeology for most of the 20th century. Pascoe's book, Dark Emu, assembled evidence from the journals of 19th century European explorers and settlers to demonstrate that the peoples they encountered were, in many regions, doing things that looked much more like farming than simple foraging. He documented the use of grinding stones to process grain crops, with the grain harvested and stored in purpose-built structures. He documented elaborate fish trap and eel management systems of considerable engineering complexity, including the Budge Bim eel farming complex in Victoria, which required the construction of a network of channels, weirs, and holding ponds that covered a significant area of landscape and allowed the systematic harvesting and management of eels as a food resource across generations. He documented villages of permanent stone houses in some regions. He documented the deliberate cultivation, encouragement, and harvesting of plant species in ways that improved yields across seasons. The response to Dark Emu was large and complicated and is not fully settled. The book became a cultural phenomenon, read by hundreds of thousands of people, adopted into school curricula, awarded major literary prizes, and treated by many readers as a necessary correction to a history that had been deliberately distorted to justify dispossession. It also attracted serious criticism, including from Aboriginal scholars and from archaeologists who argued that Pascoe had overinterpreted the historical sources, that the practices he documented were consistent with sophisticated hunter-gatherer practices that did not qualify as agriculture in the specific technical sense that term implies, and that the book inadvertently suggested that Aboriginal culture was only worth respecting if it conformed to European categories of sophistication. The underlying facts are real and not disputed. Grinding stones existed and were used. Fish traps and eel farming at Budge Bim are confirmed and now World Heritage listed. Permanent structures existed in some regions. The debate is about the appropriate categories for describing these practices and about the political implications of different framings. What is clear beyond the debate is that the peoples of pre-contact Australia were managing their landscape with sophistication and long-term planning capacity that European observers consistently failed to recognize because they were looking through a framework that defined civilization in European terms and found everything else wanting by comparison. Number 29. Deep time on Cape York. The Cape York Peninsula at the northeastern tip of Queensland points north toward New Guinea, across the Torres Strait, which was dry land during the last glacial maximum when sea levels were 120 meters lower than they are today. A broad coastal plain connecting what are now two separate landmasses. People walked that bridge. The genetic record of both Aboriginal Australian and New Guinean populations carries the signatures of those crossings, those movements back and forth, across a landscape that the sea has now covered. Cape York was, for most of the period of human presence in Australia, not the tip of a peninsula, but the narrowing northern end of a continental landmass that extended to a connection with New Guinea. The rock art of Cape York is among the most extensive and the most chronologically deep in Australia, which is itself the continent, with the deepest continuous rock art record on Earth. The art accumulates in the sheltered sandstone overhangs and rock faces of the peninsula in layers that represent multiple distinct stylistic traditions, each tradition corresponding to a different period of human occupation, with the most recent art at the top of the stratigraphic column and the oldest at the bottom or in the deepest layers on repeatedly painted surfaces. The oldest art, in the earliest stylistic layers, depicts subjects that raise an immediate question about age. The question is this: some of the figures in the earlier stylistic layers appear to depict animals that are no longer present in Australia, large animals. Animals with body plans that correspond, in some cases with considerable specificity, to species that went extinct in the Australian megafaunal extinction event approximately 45,000 to 46,000 years ago, the event that coincided with the earliest known human occupation of the continent. If those figures were painted from life, the oldest rock art on Cape York approaches 50,000 years in age. That would make it the oldest known representational art in the world, predating the cave paintings of Europe by at least a decade of millennia. The dating of rock art is an extremely difficult technical problem that direct analysis cannot yet resolve. But the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence, including the stylistic stratigraphy, the depicted fauna, and the general archaeology of the region, points toward a deep antiquity for the earliest Cape York art that very few researchers dismiss. Number 30. The night sky as science. There is a body of knowledge that has been accumulating in Australia for at least 65,000 years and possibly longer. A knowledge system that is based on careful, sustained, systematic observation of the night sky across many thousands of generations of practitioners, and that encodes in story and song and ceremony a level of astronomical sophistication that Western science is only now beginning to appreciate and measure. This knowledge system is not the quaint mythology of stargazing peoples who saw animals in the stars. It is systematic empirical science conducted across timescales that make the entire history of Western astronomy look like a brief preliminary sketch. The dark constellations of the Milky Way, the shapes formed not by bright stars, but by the dark lanes of galactic dust that interrupt the star field, are a distinctive contribution of Australian Aboriginal astronomy to the global history of skywatching. The emu in the sky, recognized by Aboriginal peoples across a broad geographic range in various forms, is a constellation formed by darkness. Its head is the Coalsack Nebula near the Southern Cross, its neck and body and legs traced by the dark rifts of the galactic dust lanes as they extend across the southern sky. The orientation of the emu in the sky changes through the year as the galactic center moves. When the emu is in a particular orientation, with its body overhead and its legs toward the south, the emus on the ground are beginning their nesting season, sitting on eggs that will hatch if left undisturbed. When the emu's orientation shifts, the nesting is over, and the eggs are no longer available. The sky is a calendar calibrated to the ecology of the landscape below it. Researchers studying Aboriginal astronomical traditions in collaboration with the communities that hold them have documented accurate astronomical knowledge encoded in oral traditions that covers topics including the periodicity of Venus, the behavior of variable stars whose brightness changes over months or years, the precession of equinoxes as it shifts star positions over centuries, and the orbital characteristics of planets visible to the naked eye. This knowledge was not recorded in books or in formal scientific documents. It was recorded in stories and songs, in the narrative structures that encode precise information, in forms that can be carried by memory and transmitted reliably between generations. The information is accurate. It has been verified by independent measurement, and it was maintained across timescales that no written scientific tradition has spanned. Number 31. The songlines of the Arabana. The Arabana people are the traditional custodians of a vast area of South Australian inland country, centred on Kadithandra Lake Eyre and extending across the river systems and desert country of the Lake Eyre Basin. For as long as their traditions reach back, the Arabana have navigated this country using a knowledge system that encodes geography, ecology, law, ceremony, and social relationship into a form that can be carried without writing, without maps, without any external storage medium except the human body and the human community. The system is called in the English language literature songlines or dreaming tracks, though neither term fully captures what is meant in the Arabana language and the Arabana tradition. A songline is a route through the landscape that was traveled by an ancestral being in the creation time, and that is encoded in a song whose verses correspond to the features of the landscape encountered along the route. Each verse describes something that a traveler on the route will encounter: a distinctive rock formation, a dry waterhole, a change in vegetation, a hill or a ridge or a depression. The verse names the feature and locates it in the sequence of the journey, and tells you what you need to know about it. A person who knows the song can navigate the landscape it describes without having physically traveled it before, because the song tells you what to expect and in what order, and the landscape confirms the song as you move through it. The song and the country are the same thing in two different forms. For the Arabana, the songlines of the Lake Eyre Basin cross-country that appears featureless and undifferentiated to anyone who does not have the knowledge to read it. The gibber plains, the clay pans, the dry creek beds, the low ridges that are almost imperceptible in the flat terrain. All of these have names, and those names are embedded in the verses of songs that locate each feature in relation to the journey of which it is a part. The dry water holes are particularly important because they represent places where water can be found by digging, even in the driest seasons, if you know the specific location and the appropriate depth. This information, encoded in the songlines, is survival information in the most literal sense. Knowing where to dig in a dry water hole is the difference between living and dying in country that receives very little rainfall and has almost no surface water outside the flood periods. The songlines are not just practical navigation tools. They are also legal documents, recording the rights and responsibilities of specific communities in specific stretches of country, and they are ceremonial structures, encoding the liturgy of religious practice in the narrative of geographical movement. They are, simultaneously, map and law and prayer and ecological almanac. The knowledge they contain was built up across thousands of generations of close observation and practical engagement with the country. It is compressed into the forms in which it can be most reliably transmitted and most accurately retrieved. It is one of the most sophisticated information management systems ever developed by any human culture, achieved without writing and maintained for longer than any written tradition has existed anywhere on Earth. Number 32. The Search for Planet 9. In 2016, the astronomers Konstantin Batygin and Mike Brown, working at the California Institute of Technology, published a paper proposing the existence of a large, undiscovered planet in the outer solar system. Their evidence was indirect: a clustering of the orbital parameters of a specific set of trans-Neptunian objects, small icy bodies in the distant outer solar system that was statistically unlikely to be coincidental and was consistent with the gravitational influence of a large planet in a highly elliptical orbit at a great distance from the Sun. They called their hypothetical planet Planet 9. And they estimated its mass at 5 to 10 times the mass of the Earth and its distance from the Sun at 400 to 800 times the Earth-Sun distance. The planet has not been found. The search for it is ongoing, and because the orbital calculations that predict the planet's existence place its most likely current sky position in the southern celestial hemisphere, the search is substantially dependent on observations made from the southern hemisphere, and particularly from some of the darkest and most radio-quiet sky in the world. Australia is where some of the most important instruments for this search are located. The Murchison Radio Astronomy Observatory sits in the Murchison region of Western Australia, about 315 kilometres northeast of Geraldton, in country so flat and so sparsely populated that the radio frequency environment is among the quietest on Earth. The Western Australian government has designated the surrounding area a radio quiet zone, restricting the use of devices that would interfere with the observatory's instruments, because even the radio emissions from ordinary electronics can contaminate the extraordinarily faint signals that modern radio telescopes are designed to detect. The Square Kilometre Array, a next-generation radio telescope that will be the most powerful of its kind ever built, is under construction with its core elements in the Murchison, alongside the existing precursor instruments. Whether Planet 9 exists is not yet known. The statistical evidence that motivated the original proposal remains contested, with some analyses finding the orbital clustering significant and others finding it less compelling when selection effects in the sample are accounted for. The search continues in optical and infrared surveys of the outer solar system, as well as in radio observations. If the planet is there, the instruments in the Australian Outback are among those most likely to find it. A world of 5 to 10 Earth masses, in the deep darkness beyond Neptune, may be making itself known through its gravitational influence on the small bodies it herds, in orbits that astronomers are measuring with increasing precision from instruments set in the red dust of the Western Australian interior. Number 33. The Mundrabilla-strewn field. The Nullarbor Plain, that vast, flat limestone expanse of southern Australia, has been collecting things from space for tens of thousands of years. The conditions for this collection are almost ideal. The surface is pale and relatively featureless, making dark, dense meteorite fragments visually conspicuous. The limestone is hard enough that fragments do not sink into it quickly. The climate is extremely dry, limiting the oxidation and breakdown of iron meteorites, and the flatness of the terrain and the absence of vegetation makes systematic surface searching practical. The result is that the Nullarbor has produced more meteorite finds per unit area than almost any other comparable region on Earth, and it continues to do so as search programs covering larger and larger areas of the plain find fragments that have been lying on the limestone surface for thousands of years, waiting for someone who knows what they are looking at. The Mundrabilla-strewn field is the largest of the Nullarbor meteorite accumulations in terms of total recovered mass. First identified in 1911 near the truck stop settlement of Mundrabilla, it has been producing fragments at intervals ever since, collected by prospectors and later by systematic scientific searches. The total mass of confirmed Mundrabilla meteorite fragments recovered exceeds 11 tons, making the Mundrabilla iron one of the largest recovered meteorite masses in the world. The largest individual fragment weighs about 12.4 kilograms and is in the collection of the Western Australian Museum. But the Mundrabilla find is only one of many strewn fields and individual meteorite finds across the Nullarbor. The region as a whole has produced meteorites from dozens of separate impact events, spanning the past 50,000 years. The oldest meteorites found on the surface have been lying there for that entire span of time, their surfaces oxidizing slowly in the dry air, their interiors still preserving the mineral textures and chemical compositions that reflect their formation in the early solar system 4.5 billion years ago. To pick up a meteorite from the Nullarbor surface is to hold an object that arrived here from the asteroid belt within the past 50,000 years, carrying in its mineralogy a record of the solar system's initial chemistry and structure. The Nullarbor collects these messages from the solar system and holds them in the limestone until someone comes along who can read them. Number 34. The Finke River and the Depth of Time. The Finke River, which flows from its headwaters in the western McDonnell Ranges of the Northern Territory southward through the Simpson Desert and eventually into the Lake Eyre system, is claimed by geologists to be the oldest river in the world. This claim requires careful framing because rivers are complex systems that change character over time, and the question of what constitutes the same river across millions of years of geological change is not simple. What the evidence supports is this: the Finke occupies a valley that has been receiving drainage from the surrounding landscape since at least the late Devonian period, approximately 340 to 350 million years ago, making the drainage system that is now the Finke among the most ancient established drainage features on the surface of the Earth. The evidence for this extraordinary antiquity comes from multiple independent sources. The geological structure of the valley shows characteristics consistent with long-term drainage that predates multiple subsequent geological events, including major changes in the regional topography. The drainage relationship between the finca and the structures it crosses, passing through ranges rather than being deflected by them in a way that implies the drainage was established before those ranges reached their current height, is consistent with an antiquity that exceeds the current topography. And the biological evidence of the Palm Valley refugium, where the Livistona mariae palms persist in conditions that are dramatically drier than their habitat requirements would suggest, implies a continuous history of groundwater availability in this gorge section that extends back to when the climate of the region was substantially wetter. The Livistona palms themselves are one of the more moving biological facts of the Australian interior. They cannot reproduce in the current climate, which is too dry to allow seedling establishment outside the very restricted microhabitat of the gorge floor. The palms that are there now are the survivors of a population that existed when the climate of the central ranges was wetter, possibly 10,000 or more years ago, when the last glacial maximum was ending and the climate of the interior was transitioning toward its current arid state. They have been standing in Palm Valley ever since, living in the groundwater of a gorge that the Finke has been cutting through the landscape for hundreds of millions of years, outliving the climate that produced them and waiting, in the patient way that ancient organisms wait, for conditions that may not return within any timescale that their individual lifespans can span. Number 35. The opalized dinosaurs of Lightning Ridge. Lightning Ridge sits in the flat, semi-arid country of northwestern New South Wales, 770 kilometres from Sydney, accessible by a highway that takes most of a day to drive and rewards the effort, with arrival in one of the most peculiar and vivid small communities in Australia. The town grew on the opal field, and the opal field grew on what was once the floor of an inland sea, and the inland sea is now 110 million years in the past, visible only in the fossils it left in the rock when it withdrew. The opal of Lightning Ridge is black opal, the rarest and most commercially valuable form of precious opal, where the spectral color play occurs against a dark body tone that intensifies the visual effect dramatically. A fine black opal shows red and green and blue against an almost black background, and the colors seem to come from inside the stone, as though there is a light source within the material that the surface is filtering rather than a light source outside that the surface is reflecting. The darkest and most color-rich stones sell for prices that place them among the most expensive gemstones per unit weight in the world. But it is the opalized fossils that deserve their own extended consideration. The Cretaceous sediments under Lightning Ridge were laid down in and around the shallow, warm sea that covered much of inland Australia 110 million years ago. In this sea and on its margins, animals lived and died. Some of them were buried in conditions where the pore spaces and the mineral structures of their bones and shells were infiltrated over millions of years by silica-rich groundwater, the original biological material being gradually replaced by silica spheres until the physical form of the bone or shell remained, but in the material of opal. The result is a three-dimensional replica of the original structure, preserving the precise geometry of the organism down to the level of individual bone texture, but composed of iridescent gemstone. Among the opalized fossils recovered from the Lightning Ridge field are the remains of multiple species of dinosaurs, small ornithopods, hypsilophodontids, and other Cretaceous fauna of southeastern Australia. The bones are scattered and fragmentary in most cases, but some finds are articulated enough to tell researchers something significant about the animals they came from. The Australian Cretaceous fauna is poorly known compared to the fossil records of North America, Europe, or Asia, and every new Lightning Ridge fossil adds information to what is essentially a very incomplete picture of the animals that lived on the landmass that would eventually become Australia, when that landmass was warmer and wetter and home to dinosaurs whose names we are still working out. The Lightning Ridge field continues to produce them in colors that no living dinosaur ever had. Number 36. The Dingo Fence. The dingo fence, sometimes called the dog fence or the wild dog barrier fence, is one of the longest structures ever constructed by human hands anywhere on Earth. It runs for approximately 5,614 kilometers in its main section, with branches and extensions that bring its total length close to 9,600 kilometers, stretching from the cliffs of the Great Australian Bight on the coast of South Australia in a great arc through the interior of South Australia and into Queensland. Its purpose is specific and practical, to separate the sheep country of southeastern Australia from the dingo country of the northwest, preventing the movement of dingoes from the large, arid western interior into the agricultural regions where sheep are grazed. The fence has been maintained since the 1880s in various forms and by various authorities, and it is still actively managed today, patrolled regularly by boundary riders who check for breaches and repair them. The dingo fence is, by the reasoning of a group of ecologists who have studied its effects, the world's longest controlled experiment in applied ecology. On either side of the fence, the climate is identical, the geology is essentially the same, the plant communities were originally similar, and the rainfall distribution is the same. The only systematic difference is the presence or absence of dingoes. On the northwestern side of the fence, dingoes are present and are the apex predator of the system. On the southeastern side, they are absent, excluded by the fence for more than a century. The ecological differences between the two sides have been studied since the 1970s, and they confirm what ecologists now understand as trophic cascade dynamics, the effect of apex predators on all the lower levels of an ecosystem, transmitted through the food web in ways that reach from the carnivore at the top all the way down to the vegetation at the base. On the dingo side of the fence, kangaroo populations are maintained at moderate levels by predation pressure, primarily on young animals, and by the behavioral effects of predation risk that cause kangaroos to move more and concentrate less, reducing overgrazing in any single area. The vegetation on the dingo side reflects this lighter grazing pressure, with greater plant diversity and less bare ground. Smaller mammals, species that require complex vegetative cover and cannot tolerate the heavily grazed conditions that exist in the absence of predation regulation, are more abundant on the dingo side. On the sheep side, without dingo pressure, kangaroo populations can grow to much higher densities. The per-kangaroo grazing pressure increases, vegetation becomes sparser and more heavily impacted. Soil is more compacted by repeated animal movement. The composition of the plant community shifts towards species that are more tolerant of heavy grazing and disturbance. The sheep graze along with the kangaroos, and the combined grazing pressure produces a landscape that is ecologically simpler and more degraded than the same landscape would be, with its natural predator present. The fence is a controlled experiment, and the experiment has produced clear results. Remove the apex predator, and the ecosystem reorganizes. The landscape looks different. The species composition changes. The productivity and complexity of the system decline. This has implications that extend far beyond the specific question of dingoes and sheep, pointing toward a broader principle about the role of top predators in maintaining the ecological condition of the landscapes they inhabit. It also raises the question of what the Australian landscape looks like in its natural dingo-present state, and whether the landscape conditions that most Australians regard as normal, having grown up in a world where dingoes are largely excluded from agricultural areas, are in fact the product of a century of ecological disruption, rather than the baseline. Number 37. Arkaroola and the heat from below. In the northern Flinders Ranges of South Australia, in a private conservation sanctuary called Arkaroola, that encompasses some of the most dramatically eroded and geologically complex terrain in a range already known for dramatic terrain, there are hot springs that make the air smell of hydrogen sulfide and that emerge from the ground at temperatures sufficient to blister the incautious hand. The Paralana hot springs sit on a fault zone that reaches into the Precambrian basement rock of the Gawler Craton, one of the oldest geological entities on the Australian continent, a block of rock that assembled itself in its current form more than 1.5 billion years ago. The fault provides a pathway for fluids from deep in the crust to rise toward the surface, carrying with them the heat generated by the radioactive decay of uranium and thorium in the granite far below. Australia has no active volcanoes in its interior. The heat that warms the Paralana Springs is not magmatic, not derived from the convective activity of a mantle plume or a spreading plate boundary. It is radiogenic, the spontaneous decay of radioactive isotopes in the granitic rocks of the basement, a process that proceeds at a rate determined by the half-lives of the isotopes involved, continuously and without any dependence on human observation or any external event. The granite of the Gawler Craton is rich in uranium and thorium by the standards of crustal rock, and it has been generating heat by radioactive decay for more than 1 billion years. Some of that heat makes its way to the surface at Paralana. The Adnyamathanha people, the traditional custodians of the Flinders Ranges, have known about Paralana for thousands of years, and approach the site with the care and respect due to a place of unusual and concentrated power. The springs are warm in a way that the surrounding landscape is not, and their warmth arises from processes below the surface that cannot be seen and that produce effects visible and tangible at the surface. In the Adnyamathanha understanding, this is a place where the properties of the deep country manifest at the surface, a point of convergence between the underground and the air, a site of concentrated significance in the broader geography of the Flinders Ranges tradition. The scientific explanation and the cultural understanding are both accurate descriptions of the same reality. The heat generated by the decay of atoms in ancient granite rising through a fault to express itself at the surface in warm, sulfurous water. Arkaroola as a whole is one of the most geologically complex landscapes in Australia. Its rocks recording events from the Archean through the Proterozoic, the mountain building events and the erosional unmaking of mountains, the intrusion of granites and the deposition of sediments, and the deformation of everything by tectonic forces over timescales, measured in hundreds of millions of years. Walking in Arkaroola is walking through geological time with a directness that few places on Earth offer. The hot springs are the exclamation point of that experience. The moment when deep time is not just visible in the rock, but tangible in the temperature of the water emerging from it. Number 38, the science of Aboriginal fire. For tens of thousands of years, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia managed the fire regime of the continent in ways that shaped its ecology as profoundly as any natural process. Fire was not merely used, it was understood. Understood in its seasonal dynamics, in its relationship to the vegetation types of different regions, in its effects on the habitat requirements of specific animals and the regeneration patterns of specific plants, in its role in the long-term maintenance of landscape diversity and productivity. The burning was deliberate, timed, spatially organized, and directed towards specific ecological outcomes that the practitioners knew how to achieve because they had been observing and refining the practice across thousands of years. The technique is sometimes called cool burning or cultural burning to distinguish it from the wildfire that burns unmanaged vegetation and from the broad-scale prescribed burning programs that government agencies conduct. Cool burning involves the application of fire to specific patches of country at specific times of year when the vegetation conditions, the wind, the moisture, and the temperature are within a range that allows a low-intensity fire that moves slowly, burns patchily, and leaves a mosaic of burned and unburned areas rather than consuming everything in its path. This mosaic is the key to understanding why the technique is ecologically powerful. A patchy burned landscape supports many more species than either uniformly burned or uniformly unburned landscape because different species have different habitat requirements and different stages of vegetation recovery provide different habitat conditions. The freshly burned areas, with their nutrient-rich ash and their fresh green shoots, attract grazing animals. The unburned patches provide cover and refuge for smaller animals that need complexity and protection. The edges between burned and unburned areas are productive zones where animals from both habitat types can access food and shelter in close proximity. A landscape managed with cool burning over many years develops a fine-grained mosaic of habitat patches in different states of recovery, and this mosaic supports a biological diversity that is not achievable under any single fire regime. When Aboriginal burning was disrupted by European colonization, through the physical displacement of burning practitioners from their country, and through the active suppression of burning by settlers who feared its effects on their pastoral operations, the fuel loads that the burning had been controlling began to build. Decades of accumulated fuel transformed the fire ecology of the continent. The fires that now burn in the southeastern states in severe fire seasons are fueled by vegetation that has not been managed by burning for generations, and they are catastrophic in ways that indigenous burning was designed to prevent. The return of cultural burning, led by Aboriginal land managers and increasingly supported by ecological research and government programs, is one of the most important environmental stories in contemporary Australia. A return to a practice that was always the right one and was interrupted for 2 centuries at enormous cost. Number 39. The dunes that sing. The Simpson Desert in the interior of Australia, crossing the borders of South Australia, Queensland, and the Northern Territory in a vast expanse of parallel linear dunes that stretches for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, is not quiet in the way that people who have not been there sometimes imagine deserts to be. The wind is almost always present in some form, and the wind moves the sand in ways that produce sound. The dry whisper of grains sliding down the slip face of a dune, the low hiss of sand moving in sheets across the ground surface in a strong wind, and occasionally, under specific conditions that researchers have studied but not fully explained, a sound of a completely different character. The booming dunes of the Simpson, described by travelers who have encountered the phenomenon across many decades, produce a sound that is deep, sustained, and resonant, sometimes compared to the lowest register of a large musical instrument, sometimes described as a humming or a moaning, sometimes characterized as a sound felt in the chest as much as heard with the ears. The sound occurs when sand moves down the steep slip face of a dune in a particular way. Not the usual random avalanche of individual grains, but a more coherent flow in which the grains in the surface layer move in a coordinated fashion that produces a vibration propagating through the flow. Under the right conditions, this vibration resonates at a frequency that radiates as audible sound. The conditions required involve a specific range of grain size and shape, a specific moisture content of the grain surfaces, a specific temperature range, and a slope angle within the parameters of the dune's natural angle of repose. The acoustic phenomenon is not unique to the Simpson. Singing or booming dunes occur in desert environments around the world, from the Sahara to the Gobi to the coastal dunes of certain Sonoran regions. What makes the Simpson Dunes distinctive is the scale of the dune field and the remoteness of the setting, which means that when the dunes sing in the Simpson, there is almost no other sound to compete with them. The sound moves across a landscape that is, in human terms, functionally silent, and it carries in the dry air for distances that are difficult to measure precisely. The Aboriginal peoples of the Simpson Desert, principally the Wankanguru and Arabana, have traditions that describe the sounds of the desert country, that incorporate the voice of the dunes into the broader acoustic experience of the landscape. A landscape that makes sounds under specific atmospheric conditions is a landscape with something to say, and the people who have lived in it longest have the vocabulary to hear it. Number 40. The Great Oxygenation Event in Stone. The most catastrophic and consequential event in the history of life on Earth was not an asteroid impact or a volcanic eruption or a glaciation or any of the other dramatic physical catastrophes that have shaped the planet's history. It was an event that unfolded very slowly, over millions of years, driven not by any geological force but by the accumulated metabolic activity of an inconceivably large number of very small organisms. It was the Great Oxygenation Event, approximately 2.4 billion years ago, when the cyanobacteria of the Archean Ocean began producing oxygen through photosynthesis in quantities sufficient to change the chemical composition of the atmosphere of the entire planet. Before this event, the atmosphere of early Earth contained almost no free oxygen. The predominant gases were nitrogen and carbon dioxide and methane and other compounds produced by volcanic activity and by the metabolic processes of the anaerobic bacteria that were then the only life on Earth. Life existed without oxygen and in many cases was actively poisoned by it. When the cyanobacteria began their photosynthetic work, the oxygen they produced initially had nowhere to go in the atmosphere because the dissolved iron in the ocean water absorbed it first, reacting with the oxygen to form iron oxide that precipitated to the seafloor in layers. These layers, alternating with silica-rich sediment, accumulated over hundreds of millions of years into the formations we call banded iron formations, the thick striped ancient rock sequences that are now exposed at the surface in the Pilbara region of Western Australia and in other ancient terrains around the world. The walls of Karijini's gorges are made of this rock. The stripes of red and black and grey that you can see and touch in the narrow passages of Wiana Gorge and Hancock Gorge and Joffre Gorge are the layers of iron oxide and silica deposited on the floor of an ocean 2.5 billion years ago by the oxygen produced by cyanobacteria performing the first sustained photosynthesis. When all the available dissolved iron in the ocean had been oxidized and precipitated, the oxygen could no longer be absorbed by the ocean chemistry. It began to accumulate in the atmosphere. The composition of the air of the planet changed from one without free oxygen to one with enough oxygen to support aerobic metabolism, and the world was transformed. For the anaerobic organisms that had dominated for the first billion or more years of life on Earth, this was an extinction event of the first order. Oxygen was toxic to them, and now it was everywhere. For the organisms that could tolerate and eventually exploit the new chemistry, it was the opening of an entirely new metabolic pathway, aerobic respiration, which generates vastly more energy per unit of food than anaerobic metabolism, and makes possible the complex, energy-hungry cellular processes that underlie all the complexity of the biological world we know. Every animal that has ever lived, every plant, every fungus, every aerobic microorganism of any kind depends on the oxygen economy established 2.4 billion years ago by the cyanobacteria of the Archean Ocean. The Pilbara is where you can see that moment. The rock is the record of the first oxygen. The gorges cut through it and expose it to the sky that its making helped create. Number 41. Desert varnish and living stone. On the exposed rock surfaces of the Australian Outback and in arid landscapes around the world, there is a coating that accumulates over centuries and millennia, and that is one of the more quietly extraordinary products of life operating in extreme conditions. Desert varnish is a thin, dense layer of manganese oxides, iron oxides, and clay minerals that builds up on rock surfaces that are exposed to the air in desert environments. In its most fully developed form, the varnish is nearly black, coating the surface so completely and evenly that rocks in the outback appear black rather than their underlying color, which might be red sandstone or gray granite or pale quartzite. The varnish has been there so long that it seems part of the rock rather than a surface accumulation. It is between 1 and 200 micrometers thick in typical cases, which is about twice the diameter of a human hair, and it is harder than the rock beneath it. The mystery of desert varnish is not how it looks, but how it forms. The manganese in the varnish is the puzzle. Manganese is not abundant in the atmosphere, and is not present in most rock types in the concentrations that the varnish would require if it was simply concentrating minerals from the rock substrate. Something is concentrating manganese from a wider source, finding it in the extremely dilute quantities present in atmospheric dust and rainwater, and the thin surface chemistry of the rock, and depositing it in the dense oxide layers of the varnish. The best current hypothesis, supported by the most recent research, is that the varnish is biological in origin, a product of the metabolic activity of a community of bacteria and archaea and fungi that live on the rock surface, scavenging the trace minerals they need from dust and film water, and the chemistry of the rock surface itself, and precipitating the manganese as an oxide as part of their metabolic processes over hundreds or thousands of years. If this hypothesis is correct, desert varnish is essentially biological rock. It is the accumulated physical product of billions of generations of microorganisms living on the surfaces of desert rocks in conditions of extreme heat, desiccation, and ultraviolet radiation, persisting in the thin moments of moisture provided by occasional rainfall and dew, extracting what they need from the thinnest imaginable chemical resources, and over centuries building up the dense, dark layer that changes the color of the rock and the look of the landscape. The Aboriginal people who use rock faces as canvases for engravings and paintings recognized that the dark surface was different from what lay beneath it, and used that difference as an artistic medium. The engravings, made by removing the dark varnish to expose the lighter stone beneath, are, in this sense, inscribed through a biological record into a geological one. The art is layered into the living history of the rock. Number 42. The Animals of the Outback Night. The Australian Outback by day presents the appearance of a landscape under maximum simplification. The heat operates as a filter, removing from visibility most of the organisms that find day on the surface incompatible with their physiology, and retaining only those specifically adapted to tolerate direct sun and extreme temperatures. The thorny devil, the central bearded dragon, the parenti monitor, some of the larger beetles and ants, the spinifex pigeons picking at seeds in the sparse shade of the hummock grass. These are the day shift. Everything else is below the surface or under a rock or pressed into the shade on the north side of a hummock, waiting. And then the temperature drops, not immediately, not dramatically, but as the sun angles down toward the western horizon and the radiation budget of the ground shifts from net gain to net loss. The heat begins to flow out of the soil into the cooling air and then into the sky above. The twilight in the outback is brief and vivid, the sky cycling through colors that do not have standard names because they are not colors that standard light sources produce. Warm and dusty and sometimes pink in ways that seem to involve the dust of the atmosphere itself as a filter. And when the light is nearly gone and the temperature is falling through the 30s into the 20s and then into the teens, the outback begins to populate itself. The bilby, Macrotus lagotus, is one of Australia's most recognizable icons of conservation concern, a large-eared, silky-furred marsupial, the size of a small rabbit that digs spiraling burrows up to 3 meters deep, and emerges at night to forage for insects and seeds and fungi and small roots with a thoroughness and a systematic intent that belies its delicate appearance. The bilby's burrow system is a significant piece of engineering. The spiral design means that the interior remains at a fairly constant temperature and humidity even as conditions outside fluctuate dramatically. And the spiral shape also makes it difficult for predators to access the occupied chamber. The bilby creates these burrows by itself, using large forefeet with claws that can excavate even compacted soils at a rate that is impressive to observe. The spinifex hopping mouse, the desert mouse, the plains mouse, the various species of native rodent that are among Australia's most ecologically specialized small mammals, and also among its most conservation threatened, emerge from their own burrows and refuges and begin their careful, efficient foraging. The striped legless lizard moves across the ground surface in ways that do not immediately suggest its lack of limbs, its body propulsion smooth and wave-like, covering the ground quickly for an animal that no conventional movement description quite fits. The frogmouth sits on its branch in the mulga tree looking exactly like a broken stump, its camouflage so precise and its stillness so complete that you could walk within a meter of it in the dark and not see it unless you knew exactly what you were looking for and how to look. This is the real community of the outback, the night shift, the majority of the species in terms of number of individuals and number of species, living their entire active lives in the hours between sunset and sunrise. They have been doing this for millions of years, adapting in their morphology and their physiology and their behavior to the specific demands of desert night life on this continent. The tragedy is that many of them are in serious decline. The red fox and the feral cat, introduced to Australia by European settlers, are extraordinarily effective predators in an environment whose native fauna had no evolutionary experience of mammalian predators with those capabilities. The bilby, the burrowing bedding, the greatest stick-nest rat, the pig-footed bandicoot now extinct, the countless species of small native mammal that have been lost or diminished across the Australian interior. They were not equipped to survive what the introduced predators were equipped to do to them. The night is quieter than it should be. The holes in the darkness where the animals should be are larger than they once were. Number 43. What Uluru actually is. Uluru is the most recognized geological feature in Australia and one of the most recognized rock formations on Earth. The photographs are familiar. A massive dome of rock rising from a flat plain, its color shifting across the day from ochre to red to purple as the angle and character of the light changes, its reflection appearing in the tourist brochures of a nation as a symbol of an ancient land and a unique country. It is a real and extraordinary thing. But most people who have seen those photographs have a fundamental intuition about it that is incorrect, and the correct understanding is itself extraordinary enough that the misconception is not needed to make the place impressive. The intuition is this: Uluru is a large rock sitting on top of the ground, a massive bump on the flat surface of the Central Australian plain. This is not what Uluru is. Uluru is the exposed edge of a rock formation that extends kilometers into the earth. What you see above the surface is a small portion of a very large structure, and the shape you see, the familiar dome, is not the top of the formation but its side. The rock, Arcos sandstone, laid down from the erosional products of an ancient mountain range approximately 550 million years ago, was buried and tilted by tectonic forces to an angle of roughly 85 degrees from horizontal, making it nearly vertical. The surface of the visible rock, the familiar dome, is a cross-section through the steeply tilted layers, not a horizontal surface viewed from above. The strata, which you can see as faint parallel striations on the rock face, run approximately vertically, not horizontally as they would if the dome shape were the top of a horizontal formation. The full extent of the rock structure descends several kilometers below the current surface of the plain. Uluru is the corner of an enormous rock slab that is mostly underground, exposed by erosion of the surrounding softer rock over many millions of years. As the erosion continues, as it has been continuing since the rock was first exhumed from the sediments that buried it, Uluru will gradually emerge further, its visible portion growing as the surrounding plain drops away on all sides. In geological time, which is not human time but is time nonetheless, this is a dynamic process, still happening, the rock still being revealed. The Anangu understanding of Uluru, which is the understanding of the people whose country this is, and whose relationship with the rock extends back to the earliest period of human presence in the Central Australian desert, is not about what the rock is made of or how it got its shape through the operation of physical and chemical processes. The Anangu understand Uluru as the physical embodiment of ancestral creation events, as a record of the activities of the Chukurpa, the creation time when the ancestral beings shaped the world and established the law. Every feature of Uluru's surface, every cave and water channel and texture and stain, corresponds to specific ancestral actions that the Anangu tradition records and interprets and maintains through ceremony. The rock is a library, it is a document. It is the physical form taken by a narrative that encompasses the origin of the world as the Anangu know it. The geological explanation of how the rock acquired its shape and composition is true and important and interesting, and it is not the only true and important and interesting thing about Uluru. Number 44. The psychology of the remote station. Australia's vast interior is dotted with pastoral stations, cattle and sheep properties of a scale that has no real parallel anywhere else in the world, outside of certain parts of South America and Southern Africa. The largest of them, Anna Creek Station in South Australia, covers approximately 24,000 square kilometres, an area larger than Israel or Wales, and runs several thousand cattle across country that receives minimal reliable rainfall and has almost no permanent surface water outside the bore water from the Great Artesian Basin. Managing a property of this scale requires a specific combination of skills, knowledge, physical resilience, and psychological adaptability that does not map onto any other kind of agricultural life, and that produces, over generations, a particular culture and a particular relationship with isolation that is distinctive enough to be worth understanding. The families who live and work on remote stations inhabit a world defined primarily by distance. Distance from medical care, which means that a broken bone or a serious cut or a snake bite is a problem with a logistical dimension as well as a medical one, requiring improvised treatment while waiting for help that may be hours away. Distance from community, which means that social life requires either considerable effort to maintain or a redefinition of what social life consists of. Distance from the accumulated infrastructure and services that urban Australians take as the baseline of normal life. The supermarket, the school, the emergency services, the range of casual commercial and social interactions that make up most of what modern Australians mean when they describe daily life. Children growing up on remote stations develop a relationship with space and quiet and self-sufficiency that is genuinely difficult to explain to people who have not experienced it. The scale of the country around them is not abstractly understood, but physically present in every direction, an enormity that is not threatening, but simply the condition of existence. When there is no horizon that is not your family's land, when the nearest town is a 4-hour drive and you go there perhaps every few weeks, when the silence at night is a silence that comes not from the absence of people nearby, but from the absence of anything man-made for dozens of kilometers, the relationship between the self and the world is calibrated on a scale that has no urban equivalent. The Royal Flying Doctor Service, the institution that provides medical care to remote Australians via aircraft, and the School of the Air, which provided radio and then satellite-based education to children on remote stations for most of the 20th century, are two of the most genuinely remarkable social innovations of Australian life. They made the remote station life medically and educationally viable without requiring the people who chose that life to surrender its defining conditions. They are, in their way, as much a part of the Australian Outback story as any geological feature or archaeological mystery, because they represent the solution that a particular society found to the problem of maintaining human community across distances that would otherwise be prohibitive. Number 45. Coongie Lakes and the Ecology of Intermittence. In the remote far northeast of South Australia, where the Strzelecki Desert meets the floodplains of the Cooper Creek system, there is a complex of lakes and wetlands that operates on a rhythm so irregular and so unpredictable that the ecology it supports had to develop across millions of years of evolutionary time to master the art of waiting. The Coongie Lakes system, protected within a national park that is one of the most remote in Australia, experiences inundation events when the Cooper Creek floods sufficiently to fill the lake basins, and then endures dry periods that may last years or decades before the next filling. The interval between significant flood events has historically ranged from a few years to more than a decade, and the ecological community of the Coongie system has adapted to this radical intermittence in ways that represent some of the most striking biological specializations in the inland of the continent. The fish of the Coongie Lakes survive the dry periods by contracting their populations into the permanent waterholes of the Cooper Creek main channel, where water persists even in the driest years, often in conditions of extreme warmth and oxygen depletion that push the fish to the very limits of physiological tolerance. Some species gulp air at the surface in these conditions, supplementing their gill breathing with atmospheric oxygen in the way that the ancestors of the first air-breathing vertebrates did in the shallow oxygen-poor waters of the Devonian period. The fish wait in these conditions for months or years. When the flood comes, they emerge into the expanding water and their populations explode. Breeding triggers immediately. Growth rates accelerate in the nutrient-rich, warm floodwater. The young of the year mature rapidly, capitalizing on the abundance before it disappears again. The water birds respond to the filling of Coongie with an urgency and a coordination that has never been adequately explained in terms of the information available to individual birds. Pelicans arrive from distant coastal and inland colonies within days of a significant filling event, before any conventional communication between the lake and those colonies could have conveyed the information that a good breeding site has become available. They arrive in their tens of thousands when the filling is substantial. Banded stilts, which breed explosively at inland lakes and almost nowhere else, arrive in numbers that can approach hundreds of thousands. They breed in dense colonies on islands and sandbars in the temporary lake, raising chicks on the small crustaceans that appear in the alkaline mineralized water of the flooded lake within days of the flooding. The window between flooding and departure is often a matter of months. In that window, an entire breeding season must be completed, from courtship to fledging, and the birds time it with a precision that implies an understanding of the temporal dynamics of the system that we cannot fully account for. The Yandrawanda and Yawarrawarka peoples are the traditional custodians of the Coongie Lakes country, and their knowledge of the flood ecology and the intermittent abundance of the system is encoded in their traditions in ways that represent thousands of years of systematic observation and practical engagement. They know the signals that precede a flood event in the upper catchment and predict the arrival of water at the lakes. They know the locations of permanent water across the surrounding country in dry periods. They know when the fish are in the water holes and when they have spread across the floodplain. This knowledge is survival knowledge of the most direct kind. The Coongie Lake system is a demanding teacher and a generous provider, in a ratio and at a rhythm that only long experience makes navigable. Number 46. The Dinosaur Stampede at La Quarry. About 110 kilometers south of Winton in the red-rolling Mitchell grass country of central western Queensland, there is a slab of ancient sandstone protected within a building and approached by boardwalk that contains the frozen moment of an event that happened 95 million years ago on the muddy shore of a Cretaceous water body. The Lark Quarry Conservation Park exists to protect approximately 300 individual dinosaur footprints, made in quick succession by animals in a state of panic, preserved when the mud that recorded the event was buried, and eventually lithified and then exposed again by erosion in time to be found, studied, protected, and wondered at by the descendants of mammals who were not yet in existence when the tracks were made. Most of the tracks were made by small bipedal dinosaurs. Small ornithopods, plant-eating animals roughly the size of a chicken or a small turkey, and coelurosaurs of similar body size. Lightly built theropods that would have been fast and agile on their feet. They were moving quickly, these small animals, in the same general direction, across the mud surface at the water's edge. Their tracks show acceleration, the gait patterns characteristic of animals increasing their speed toward a maximum. They were running. And entering the preserved track surface from one end, moving toward the small animals, is a different set of tracks, large tracks. Tracks made by an animal whose individual footprints are about 55 centimeters in length, whose stride pattern indicates a quadruped that was moving at a deliberate pace, whose size relative to the small animals is sufficient to have eaten any of them without particular effort. A large theropod, probably a type of ornithomimosaur, or a large carnivorous dinosaur of one of the forms known from the Cretaceous of Australia, was moving along the water's edge. The small animals saw it, or smelled it, or heard it, and they ran. The moment is preserved in full. The acceleration of the small animals is visible in the spacing of their footprints. The convergence of the small animal tracks toward the far end of the slab, away from the large tracks, is visible in the distribution of the prints across the surface. The large animals' tracks intersect with areas where the small animals had been, the impressions of their passage overlapping in the mud that was recording everything with the faithful impartiality of soft sediment, doing what soft sediment does when weight is applied to it. This is not a reconstruction or an interpretation. This is the physical record of a specific event on a specific day 95 million years ago, preserved by geological processes that took no interest in the biological drama they were archiving, but preserved it anyway, because that is what geology does with the physical record of the world it inherits. Standing on the boardwalk above the slab and looking down at the prints, the small three-toed impressions of the fleeing animals and the large, widely spaced prints of the predator, there is a moment when the 95 million years collapses into something approaching the present. These animals were running. Their individual terror was real. Their individual momentum was real. The individual force of each foot striking the mud at the edge of a Cretaceous lake in Queensland was real, and left a record that has survived to be seen. The Outback contains the last footprints of 100,000 animals that are gone. This particular set is one of the few that has a story you can read in a single glance. Number 47. The silence at 3 in the morning. There is an hour in the remote outback that has no equivalent in any urban or suburban or even rural setting in the more populated parts of the world. It is the hour around 3 in the morning when the temperature has reached its overnight low and the nocturnal animals have completed the most active phase of their foraging, and the insects of the evening have subsided and the owls have gone quiet, and the wind, which can be present in the outback at any hour, has often stilled in the pre-dawn hours. In this hour, in country far enough from any road or settlement or generator, or any source of anthropogenic sound, there is a silence that has a physical quality. It is not the silence of a room with good insulation. It is not the silence of a library or a church or a recording booth. Those silences are defined by the absence of external noise within a bounded space. The silence of the outback at 3 in the morning is different because it has no boundary. It extends to every horizon in every direction, and beyond every horizon to the limits of the landscape itself. There is no wall at which the silence ends. It is the silence of a very large space in which very little is currently making any sound. And the scale of the space is part of what the silence communicates. You are small, the quiet is large. And in the gap between those two facts, something happens to consciousness that does not happen in other conditions. The Aboriginal peoples of the Australian interior have recognized this hour for as long as their traditions reach back. It appears in the ceremonial frameworks of multiple communities as a time of particular significance, a time when certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of communication become accessible. This is not the language of superstition, as the term is typically applied by people who have not experienced what is being described. It is the language of an observation about the relationship between external conditions and internal states. In sufficient silence and in sufficient dark and in sufficient open space, the mind does things that it does not do under other conditions. It notices differently. It associates differently. It is available to certain kinds of input that the noise of ordinary life masks. The neuroscience of this is not mysterious. Sensory quieting, the reduction of external input to very low levels, is associated with changes in the default mode network of the brain, with shifts in the quality of attention from externally directed to internally generated, with increases in certain kinds of associative thinking and decreases in the constant monitoring of the environment that is the baseline brain state of animals evolved to survive in a world that contains predators and unexpected events. The silence of the outback at 3 in the morning is a natural sensory deprivation condition of extraordinary completeness, created not by technology, but by the scale of a very old and very empty landscape. What it produces in the minds of the people sitting in it is what it has always produced in the minds of the people who have lived in this country, generation after generation, across the tens of thousands of years of its continuous occupation. Number 48. The Aryan grass wren. In the Arabana country of the Lake Eyre Basin, in the thick stands of canning grass that grow in the seasonally flooded swales and channel margins of the drainage systems feeding into Kadithanda, there is a bird that has achieved the remarkable distinction of being among Australia's least known resident vertebrate species, despite being studied by ornithologists for more than 150 years. The Aryan grass wren, Amitornis goideri, is a small grass wren, a member of a family of secretive Australian birds, adapted to dense low vegetation in arid and semi-arid environments, whose life history is known in outline and almost not at all in detail. The bird was described by the Gould associate Frederick William Andrews in 1874 from a specimen collected at Dalhousie Springs. It was then not recorded again for more than 40 years. The gap between the 1874 description and the next confirmed record is itself a commentary on the bird's habitat. Dense canning grass stands in the remote interior of South Australia, are not places that ornithologists visit frequently, and a small secretive bird that moves through the base of the cane grass stems and rarely flies is not a bird that presents itself readily to observation even when observers are present. The Aryan grass wren has been found multiple times across the 20th century in scattered localities across the Lake Eyre Basin, always in the same specific habitat, always in small numbers, always difficult to see and to study. What is known about its biology is fragmentary in a way that reflects how little time has been spent with it in the field. It appears to be monogamous. It appears to breed during and after good rainfall events, when the canning grass is dense and the food resources of the wetland environment are abundant. Its diet is presumed to include invertebrates and seeds. Its response to the flooding and drying cycles of its canning grass habitat is not understood in any detail. How it moves between patches of suitable habitat when flooding eliminates one patch and creates another elsewhere is not known. Whether it has a stable population across the basin or whether it contracts and expands dramatically with the flood cycles is not established. The Arabana people have always known this bird. It has names in their language. It has a place in the detailed ecological knowledge that the Arabana carry about the living things of their country, knowledge built from continuous observation across thousands of years of living in and around the same habitat where the grass wren lives. The bird is not a mystery to the people of the country. It is a well-known and properly named element of the landscape. The Western scientific record of it is thin because Western science has barely looked. The grass wren waits in the cane grass, as it has always waited, attending to the business of its life in the specific habitat that the lake air basin provides in its wet phases, and the cane grass rustles, and the bird moves through it, and for the most part, no one is watching. Number 49. Maralinga and the Spinifex people. Maralinga is a place name in the Pitjantjatjara language, and it means something that translates roughly as thunder, which turned out to be an appropriate name for a site in the South Australian desert where, between 1956 and 1963, the British government conducted a program of nuclear weapons tests with the formal agreement of the Australian government and in total disregard for the rights of the people whose country it was. 7 major nuclear weapon detonations, and hundreds of minor trials testing weapon components and studying the behavior of radioactive materials in the environment were conducted at Maralinga. The contamination that resulted from these tests covered a substantial area of country with radioactive particles and compounds that persist in the environment for centuries. The tests were conducted with an assumption that was false and that was known to be inadequate at the time, that the country was empty. The Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara peoples, whose traditional country included the Maralinga test site and the surrounding desert, had been substantially relocated to missions and settlements in the years preceding the tests. But the relocation was not complete, and the assumption of emptiness was not verified. There were people in the country, there were communities, specifically groups that had maintained their traditional way of life in the deep western desert into the mid-20th century without sustained contact with the settlement economy, who were moving through the test area during and after the testing program. They were referred to in government documents as nomads, a term used in a way that conveyed that their presence was not a consideration that required planning around. These people, sometimes called the Spinifex people for the Spinifex grass country they lived in, encountered the aftermath of the nuclear tests. In documented cases, people moved through areas that had been contaminated by the tests without any warning or protection. They found objects and materials in and around the test sites that they did not recognize, and that, not understanding the danger, they touched and examined and sometimes moved. The government personnel responsible for the tests were aware that people were in the country, and were aware that their movements were potentially putting them in contact with radiological hazards. The response to this knowledge was, in the documented record, inadequate in ways that subsequent royal commissions and parliamentary inquiries have established in considerable detail. The cleanup of Maralinga, conducted in the 1990s at Australian government expense, was itself controversial, with questions about its completeness and its methodology that have not been fully resolved. The Maralinga Tjarutja people, the traditional owners of the country, received formal recognition of their rights to the land in 1984, and the land was handed back to them in 2009 in a ceremony that acknowledged both the legal return of the country and the profound harm done to it and to the people in whose country the tests had been conducted. The story of Maralinga is not a mystery story in the conventional sense of this list. It does not involve the unexplained or the uncertain. What happened there is documented and established. It is a story of what is possible when a government decides that certain people's presence in their own country is an administrative inconvenience rather than a fact that requires their treatment as human beings with rights. Number 50. The sky at 3 in the morning over the Red Centre. This is not an entry about a historical discovery or a geological feature or an anomalous event. It is an entry about an experience. A specific experience available only in specific places, of which the Australian interior is one of the best on Earth, and at a specific time, which is the hour around 3 in the morning when the sky is rotated to put the galactic center overhead, and the conditions are clear and dry and without wind. And there is no artificial light source within the range at which such sources pollute the naked eye view of the sky. In those conditions in the Australian interior, the Milky Way does not appear as a faint smear across the sky. It appears as a structural element of the scene, a broad band of light so dense and varied in its composition that the word smear is inadequate to describe it. It has texture, it has depth. The central region of the galaxy, the bulge at the center of the disk, where the density of stars is greatest, is a distinct and brilliant area of the sky that you can see with your unaided eyes. The dark lanes of galactic dust that run along the disk divide the light into separate streams and lobes. The Coalsack Nebula sits near the Southern Cross, a dark oval in the field of stars, the absence so definite against the brightness around it that it seems almost to be something rather than nothing. The large Magellanic Cloud and the small Magellanic Cloud hang low toward the south, detached patches of light that are, if you know what you're looking at, entire separate galaxies, companion galaxies to the Milky Way, each containing tens of billions of stars, visible to the naked eye from the southern hemisphere as two luminous clouds near the horizon of a dark sky site. The photons arriving at your eyes from the galactic center left their sources approximately 25,000 years ago. 25,000 years ago, the last ice age was at its maximum. Sea levels were 120 meters lower than they are today, and Australia was a larger and colder place. The people living in Australia at that time were the ancestors of the Aboriginal peoples of today, and they were watching this same sky, this same galactic center, this same structure of light and dark from these same latitudes. They were building the astronomical knowledge that their descendants carried forward in oral tradition for 25,000 years until the present moment, when the light that left the galactic center at the same time they were watching it is arriving at your eyes in a paddock in the red center, while everything's quiet and the temperature is dropping toward dawn, and the bilby has gone back to its burrow, and the desert is doing what it has always done in the hour before the light comes back. Number 51. The underground town of White Cliffs. White Cliffs is a small town in the far northwest of New South Wales, about 90 kilometres north of Broken Hill, in country that is flat and pale and dry, the vegetation low and sparse, the sky a blue that has nothing to interrupt it from horizon to horizon. The town was founded on opal and has been a mining community since the late 19th century, its fortunes rising and falling with the price of the stone and the richness of the ground in any given season. And like Coober Pedy in South Australia, it discovered early in its history that the most rational response to summer temperatures that regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius in a landscape with almost no natural shade and no reliable local water was to put the living space below the surface of the earth. The underground homes and workrooms of White Cliffs, called dugouts in the tradition of the region, range from modest single-room excavations to extensive multi-room residences that have been enlarged and elaborated over generations of occupation. The rock that underlies White Cliffs is opaline sandstone, softer than the surrounding rock types and easy to excavate with basic tools, but stable enough to hold a carved ceiling without requiring extensive support structures. The temperature in a White Cliffs dugout is approximately 22 degrees Celsius year-round, a consistency that is both comfortable and economically significant in an environment where cooling a surface structure to habitable temperatures in summer would require constant and expensive energy input. The underground temperature is the gift of the Earth's own thermal mass, holding the average temperature of the environment averaged across the seasonal cycle. White Cliffs opal is distinct from the famous black opal of Lightning Ridge. The White Cliffs field produces predominantly crystal opal and light opal, where the play of color appears against a white or clear background that gives the colors a different quality from the intense fire of the black opal. White Cliffs opal can produce greens and blues of exceptional clarity, and the occasional piece with a broad color pattern across the full visible spectrum, called a harlequin pattern in the trade, that represents one of the most prized forms of opal from any field. The field has been productive since 1889 and is not exhausted, though the easily accessible near-surface workings of the early period have given way to deeper and more demanding mining. Like Lightning Ridge, the White Cliffs field sits in Cretaceous sediments, the deposits of the inland sea that covered much of inland Australia 110 million years ago. And like Lightning Ridge, the silica-rich water that formed the opal sometimes replaced the mineral structure of the organisms that lived in and around that sea, creating opalized fossils of marine invertebrates, fish, and occasionally vertebrates of larger size. These opalized fossils are the most extraordinary products of the White Cliffs field, combining the scientific importance of the fossil record with the aesthetic dimension of precious stone in objects that have no analog in any other geological context. The town that sits on top of them, built partly above and partly below the same ancient seafloor, is itself one of the stranger places that the Australian continent's geological history has produced. Number 52, the drowned world of the continental shelf. The Australia that exists today is not the Australia that existed 20,000 years ago. The continent is the same, its bedrock is the same, the ancient geological structures that underlie it are unchanged in any way that the timescale of human history can measure. But the shape of Australia at the ocean's edge is different, because 20,000 years ago, the ocean was not where it is now. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, sea levels around the world were between 120 and 130 meters lower than they are today. The enormous volumes of water that now circulate in the ocean were locked in the ice sheets of the Northern Hemisphere, in the great ice caps that covered Scandinavia and Scotland and Canada, and much of Siberia, and their absence from the ocean lowered the sea surface globally. The continental shelves of every landmass were exposed. The coastlines were extended far beyond their current positions. In the case of Australia, the consequences were dramatic in geographic terms. The shallow Bass Strait between mainland Australia and Tasmania was dry land, an arc of coastal plain and low hills connecting the two landmasses. People who lived in what is now Tasmania 20,000 years ago walked to the mainland across country that is now 70 metres under the sea. The Gulf of Carpentaria, the broad, shallow bay in northern Australia between Queensland and the Northern Territory, was a freshwater lake or an interconnected series of freshwater lakes, fed by rivers from both sides of the current Gulf. New Guinea and Australia were a single landmass. The continent of Sahul, as researchers call the combined Australia-New Guinea of the glacial maximum, was larger than Australia is today by hundreds of thousands of square kilometres. All of this means that the coastlines where Aboriginal people lived 20,000 years ago are now underwater. The beaches where they gathered shellfish, the river mouths where they fished and camped, the estuaries and headlands and bays that they named and knew and returned to across generations, the rock platforms and the sand dunes and the freshwater springs where the coastal communities of that period made their lives, these landscapes are now in many cases between 60 and 130 metres below the surface of the sea. The entire coastal archaeology of ancient Australia, the record of the communities that lived at the ocean margin for the full period of the glacial maximum, and the transition into the Holocene is underwater. This is one of the great frontiers of Australian and indeed world archaeology. Systematic underwater archaeological survey of the Australian continental shelf has been undertaken in limited areas, particularly off the northwest coast of Western Australia, where the shelf is broad and shallow and the water conditions sometimes permit survey. Stone artifacts have been found on the seafloor. Remnants of ancient freshwater springs, now submerged, have been located and their freshwater tested and found to contain traces of biological material, consistent with long-term use by the people who lived near them. The drowned world is still there, below the shallow sea, waiting for the development of the technology and the sustained commitment of resources necessary to read it. Number 53. The Gibbo Plains. The Gibbo Plains are a landscape that looks from a distance like an open, flat, stone-paved surface, the kind of material used to pave old courtyards or to construct the floors of buildings before concrete became universal, but extended across areas that can run to hundreds of square kilometres without interruption. Gibber is the Aboriginal term for the rounded, polished, dark stones that cover these plains, and the term has been absorbed into Australian geological vocabulary as the standard term for this surface type. The stones are typically between a few centimetres and about 15 or 20 centimetres in diameter, rounded by long periods of fluvial transport or chemical weathering in an earlier period of wetter climate, now resting on the surface of the plain in a concentration that has accumulated over thousands of years by a process called deflation. Deflation is the removal of fine-grained material from a sediment surface by wind. The wind can move sand and silt and clay particles, but cannot move stones above a certain size and weight. Over time, wind removes the fine material between and around the stones, and the stones are left behind in increasing concentration as everything that can be moved is moved. The result is a surface armor, a lag deposit of the material that is too heavy to go anywhere, self-perpetuating because the stone surface inhibits further deflation of the sediment beneath it and creates a condition where the surface stabilizes in the current armored state. The Gibber Plain, once established, tends to maintain itself. The stones themselves carry a history that exceeds their current position on the surface. Many of them are silcrete fragments, pieces of a very hard silica-cemented rock that forms when groundwater deposits silica near the surface under the warm, wet conditions associated with earlier, moister climates in the Australian interior. The siltcrete formed when there was significantly more surface water in the interior than there is today, and the gibber fragments that cover the plains are the remnants of siltcrete layers that formed in those wetter times, and have been progressively broken down and polished and transported by subsequent fluvial and aeolian processes into the rounded pebbles on the current surface. Walking on a gibber plane is walking on the debris of a landscape that used to exist, a wetter landscape that the current aridity has broken down and reorganized into what you see. In the early morning of the outback, the dew that has condensed on the cold stone surface of the gibber overnight catches the first horizontal light of the rising sun and the plane glitters. The individual stones, each one reflecting the sky above it, produce a collective shimmer that transforms the otherwise uniform surface into something temporarily incandescent. By mid-morning, the dew is gone, the stones are dry and absorbing heat, and the plane has returned to its usual monochrome endurance. In the late afternoon, when the sun is low again and the light is angled across the surface, the shadows of each individual stone extend to the east, and the plane becomes a three-dimensional texture of stone and shadow, each pebble with its own dark companion. The gibber planes are not the same landscape at different times of day. They are the same stones, but different light, and the light makes them different places. Number 54. The moving stones of the Sturt Stony Desert. The Sturt Stony Desert, which occupies parts of South Australia and southwestern Queensland, is a region of gibber plain and salt lake and dry river channel in some of the most remote interior country in Australia. It is named for the explorer Charles Sturt, who attempted to cross it in 1845 on his expedition searching for the inland sea that some European geographers still believed might exist at the center of the continent. Sturt did not find an inland sea. He found conditions of extreme heat and aridity that nearly killed his party and that forced a months-long wait in a creek bed before temperatures dropped enough to permit the return journey. The desert that bears his name is not an easy place for any expedition, but among the stones of the Sturt Stony Desert and in certain other gibber and desert environments in the Australian interior, there is a phenomenon that has attracted scientific interest for its demonstration of a process more usually associated with cold, high-latitude environments: the movement of stones across the surface of the ground by the expansion and contraction of the soil beneath them. The Sturt Stony Desert, which has a reputation primarily for summer heat, also experiences winter nights with temperatures below 0 Celsius, and these freezing nights drive a process of soil movement that can, over many cycles and many seasons, produce measurable displacement of stones across the surface. The mechanism involves the freezing of water in the soil pores and cracks around and beneath the stones. When the water freezes, it expands, and the expansion can produce small lateral forces on the stones that shift them slightly from their position. The thawing that follows allows the soil to partially resettle, but not in exactly the previous configuration. Over many freeze-thaw cycles across many winters, these small incremental shifts accumulate into displacements that can be measured, and the pattern of displacement is influenced by the slope of the surface, the shape and mass of the individual stones, and the soil composition in ways that sometimes produce organized patterns. Lines of stones roughly aligned with the slope, polygonal patterns on flatter ground. The same process produces the patterned ground features of tundra and high-altitude environments, where freeze-thaw cycling is more intense and more frequent. That it also operates more subtly in the interior of the Australian outback is a reminder that this landscape experiences a wider range of conditions than its summer reputation implies. Number 55. The Painted Caves of the Flinders Ranges. The Flinders Ranges of South Australia rise from the surrounding plains in a series of folded and eroded ridges and ranges that contain within their geology one of the most complete records of the Precambrian-Cambrian transition in the world, a period of Earth history when animal life first appeared in the fossil record in forms complex enough to leave mineralized remains. The Ediacaran biota, named for the Ediacara hills within the ranges, are the oldest complex multicellular organisms known from the fossil record, soft-bodied creatures from 550 to 580 million years ago, whose forms are strange enough that their relationship to modern animal groups was debated for decades after their discovery in the 1940s. The rock of the Flinders Ranges is, in parts, the record of the first animals. Within this ancient landscape, in the sheltered sandstone overhangs and the cave openings and the protected rock faces of the gorge country, there is rock art, Not a single site or a single tradition, but a distributed presence of paintings and engravings that extends across many locations in the ranges, and that represents the work of many hands across many generations, accumulated over timescales that the researchers who study these sites are still working to understand. The Adnyamathanha people, who are the traditional custodians of the Flinders Ranges, carry knowledge of these sites in their traditions that establishes their significance within the living culture of the community, not as historical artifacts, but as active elements of the ceremonial and cosmological geography of the country. The subjects of the Flinders Ranges art include animals that are no longer present in the ranges, species displaced by changes in habitat and climate, and by the impacts of European pastoral settlement. Some of the figures appear to depict animals that have been extinct in the broader region for much longer than the historical period, which raises the same questions that arise in relation to the oldest rock art of Cape York and the Kimberley. How old is the art, and does it record the presence of animals from a time before the current ecological configuration of the region was established? The paintings accumulate at some sites in layers, newer work overlying older, the succession of images building up across time into a palimpsest in which the oldest layers are visible beneath and through the newer ones in places where the newer pigment is thin enough to be partly transparent. This layering is not accidental. The choice to paint in a place already painted is a choice, a decision to add to an existing conversation rather than to begin a new one in an unmarked location. The later artist is in dialogue with the earlier one. The site is the medium of that dialogue, the physical space in which a conversation has been ongoing for as long as people have been in this country. The last painting is not the last word. The last painting is where the conversation currently sits, waiting for the next person who knows this country well enough and has the right relationship with it to add their voice. The cave absorbs the light of each day passing and gives it back in the reflections from the pigmented surface. The mountain folds its rock and waits for whatever comes next. And the conversation continues, which is what conversations in healthy cultures do. And so we come to the end of tonight's list, 55 strange and ancient and beautiful and unexplained things from the Australian Outback. 55 points of entry into a landscape that has been doing things for longer than any other inhabited place on Earth. And that keeps its best secrets in the patient way of very old things, in the rock and the art and the knowledge of the people who have never stopped paying attention. You have traveled tonight through craters made by rocks from the outer solar system and through gorges that expose the walls of a 2.5 billion year old ocean floor. You have visited underground towns built by people solving the problem of extreme heat and underground homes carved from rock that sometimes produced gems when the excavation went through a promising seam. You have sat with the mystery of giant figures carved into the earth by unknown hands and with the mystery of hieroglyphs on sandstone that no professional consensus has yet explained to everyone's satisfaction. You have listened to the singing of sand dunes in a desert that is larger than most countries, and to the silence of an hour before dawn when everything has paused at once. The Australian Outback is not empty. It has never been empty. It is among the fullest places on Earth, full of time and full of knowledge and full of the kind of mystery that does not resolve itself when you look at it hard enough, but deepens instead, revealing behind each answered question 3 that had not occurred to you to ask. This is the best kind of mystery, the kind that keeps the world interesting. Let yourself drift now. Let the red dust settle in your mind. Let the stars come out over the open country in numbers that the city never shows you. Let the Finke River run its course through the oldest valley on Earth, carrying the same water it has always carried to the same lake that has been receiving it for 340 million years. Let the bilby complete its circuit of its territory and return to the spiral burrow and descend into the earth and rest. The Outback is there. It will be there when you wake. And whatever you carry of it from tonight into your morning, it is yours to keep. Sleep well. Let us linger here for a moment in the country we have been moving through. The Australian Outback is not a single thing. It is many things occupying the same geographic category. And the word outback itself is a term that works more as a direction than a destination, a way of pointing toward the interior, toward the away from the coast, toward the large and dry and sparsely populated middle of the continent. What lies in that direction includes everything from the red sandstone of the Northern Territory to the pale limestone of the Nullarbor, to the grey-green saltbush of the western New South Wales plains, to the yellow spinifex domes of the Great Sandy Desert. None of these looks like the others. All of them are the Outback. What they share is equality of scale. In the Outback, things are big. Not just the individual features, the craters and the ranges and the lake beds, though those are big. The space between the features is big. The silence between sounds is big. The time between events, measured in the units that the landscape uses to count time, which are not years or decades but geological periods, is big. Sitting in the middle of the Australian interior, you are sitting in the middle of a landscape that measures itself in units of millions of years, and that regards the entire span of human civilization as a very recent and somewhat brief experiment. The red sand under your feet may have been red sand for hundreds of thousands of years. The rock formation visible on the horizon may have been in roughly that form for tens of millions of years. The stars overhead have been watching the continent from that same sky for billions of years, and the peoples who have lived under that sky have been watching the stars for 65,000. This is the context in which all of these discoveries, all of these mysteries, all of these strange and unexplained and inexplicable things exist. They exist not in historical time, but in geological and cosmological time, in the kind of time that makes the words old and ancient seem like toys, like small containers being asked to hold something very large. The Maori man is 26 years old in one sense, and perhaps thousands of years old in another, and sits in a landscape that is millions of years old. The meteorite craters are 5,000 years old, and the rock they sit in is millions of years old, and the iron in the meteorites is billions of years old. Time in the outback is layered rather than linear, and each discovery sits in multiple layers simultaneously. And so do we when we sit with these things. We are very recent, evolutionarily speaking. Modern humans arrived in Australia perhaps 65,000 years ago, which is recent in geological time, though it is the full span of our cultural and behavioral modernity. We are made of atoms that were synthesized in stars that existed before the solar system, which gives us a biological antiquity that exceeds our species' antiquity by billions of years. And we are sitting right now in whatever position and whatever place you find yourself at this hour of the night, connected to all of this through the medium of attention and curiosity, and the peculiar human habit of caring about things that do not immediately and directly benefit our survival. We care about the Gosford glyphs. We care about the Gwion figures. We care about the thylacine. We care about what is at the bottom of the Nullarbor caves, and who made the Maori man, and whether the oldest river in the world still carries memories of the Devonian seas it has been draining toward for 340 million years. This caring is not accidental. It is what consciousness, given enough quiet and enough time, does with itself. Let the country continue to move through you as we keep going. We are past the halfway point of this journey, and the strangeness has been deepening rather than exhausting itself, which is the quality of genuine mystery as opposed to the manufactured kind. The manufactured kind runs out. It has a bottom where you get to the explanation, and the explanation is satisfying and the question closes. Genuine mystery deepens. The more carefully you look at it, the more layers you find beneath the surface layer. And the more you realize that the surface layer was not the thing itself, but the top edge of something that goes down much further than you initially estimated. The Great Artesian Basin goes down several kilometers. The opal fields of Lightning Ridge and White Cliffs in Coober Pedy go down through 100 million years of sedimentation. The rock art of the Kimberley goes down through 17,000 years of continuous human artistic activity. The songlines of the Arabana go down through the geological history of the Lake Eyre Basin, through flood cycles and drought cycles, and the long, slow processes by which a landscape acquires its character across deep time. And the people who maintain these traditions, the Arabana and the Adnyamathanha and the Anangu and the Matu and the Wik and the Mwanjum and the hundreds of other communities whose traditional country lies within what the rest of Australia calls the Outback, they are carrying knowledge systems that are as deep as the landscape they describe, accumulated across the same timescales, refined by the same processes of observation and experience and transmission that have made the Outback knowledge tradition the oldest continuous intellectual enterprise in human history. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia are sometimes described, in discussions that mean well, as having a special spiritual relationship with the land. This framing, while it comes from a place of intended respect, tends to understate what is actually going on. The relationship between Aboriginal peoples and their country is not primarily spiritual, in the sense that the word spiritual is typically used as something distinct from practical and scientific and legal. It is all of those things at once. It is a practical knowledge of where the water is and when the animals are available and how to process the foods the country produces. It is a scientific knowledge of the patterns of climate and ecology and astronomy that govern the behavior of the landscape across its full range of conditions. It is a legal framework that governs who has rights in what country and under what conditions, with what obligations and what privileges. And it is a ceremonial and cosmological framework that situates all of this within a broader narrative of meaning, which is what every culture does with its relationship to the world it inhabits. The combination of all of these things is not a spiritual relationship. It is a civilizational relationship. The product of a civilization that has been operating in the same landscape for 65,000 years. There is something worth noting about the way that the landscape of the outback accumulates stories. Not all landscapes do this equally. Some landscapes are overwritten by each successive wave of occupation. The traces of earlier inhabitants erased or submerged beneath the deposits of later ones. Cities are particularly prone to this. London sits on top of Roman London, which sits on top of Celtic London, which sits on top of several thousand years of riverbank occupation, each layer mostly inaccessible beneath the weight of what came after. The palimpsest of London is real, but it is mostly theoretical for anyone who does not have access to the archaeological record, because the surface of the city gives very little clue to the depths below it. The outback is different. The aridity that makes it hostile to dense human occupation has also made it extraordinarily preserving of the evidence of past occupation. Things do not decay in dry air as they do in moist air. Stone survives indefinitely. Pigments on sheltered rock faces persist for tens of thousands of years. Footprints in dried mud lithify and become rock, and wait 95 million years to be seen. Meteorite fragments from a fall 5,000 years ago are still lying on the surface of the Gibber Plain, recognizable as what they are, in the same general area where they landed. The oral traditions of communities who have lived in this landscape for tens of thousands of years have been maintained with a robustness and a fidelity that seems improbable until you understand the mechanisms by which they are transmitted, the narrative structures that encode information in forms that are simultaneously memorable and recoverable, the ceremonial practices that review and reinforce the information at regular intervals, the social structures that distribute knowledge across communities in ways that prevent any single loss from being catastrophic. The outback preserves things. This is why it has so many mysteries. It has not erased the evidence of the past. It has kept it in the rock and the sand and the knowledge of the people who know it best, for anyone patient enough to look and humble enough to listen to those who have been looking longest. The particular quality of attention that the outback demands, and that the hour of 3 in the morning enforces with a completeness that makes the demand irresistible, is a quality that modern life has made unusual. But that was for most of human history the ordinary baseline condition of conscious experience. For the overwhelming majority of the time that modern humans have existed, the world at night was dark and largely quiet. And the interior life of individuals sitting in that dark and quiet was shaped by the conditions of the dark and the quiet in ways that are difficult to recover once the conditions have changed. What did people think about? What did they notice? What connections did they make between the sky above them and the land around them and the stories they had been told and the patterns they had observed? We have in the oral traditions of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia and in the rock art that encodes some of those traditions in visual form, some of the best available evidence for what people thought about in those conditions across 65,000 years of thinking. And it is complex, it is systematic. It is connected to the world in ways that require careful, sustained observation to achieve, and that produce, when they are achieved, a knowledge of the natural world that is as precise and as practically valuable as any knowledge produced by the scientific tradition that has emerged in the last few centuries in a different cultural context. The ozone layer is thinner over Antarctica than anywhere else on Earth, and the ultraviolet radiation that reaches the high latitudes of the southern hemisphere is more intense as a result. The night sky over the Australian interior is as dark as any accessible to human observation because there are no major population centres for hundreds of kilometres in any direction. The geology of the continent is among the most ancient accessible anywhere. The biological diversity of the outback is the product of millions of years of evolution and isolation on an island continent. The human cultural tradition of the Australian interior is the oldest continuous tradition of which we have reliable evidence. All of these things are true of the same place, and none of them is unrelated to the others. The antiquity of the geology produced the aridity that maintained the isolation, that produced the unique biology that shaped the conditions of the human occupation that generated the oldest traditions. It is one story, very long and very complicated, and not yet finished, happening in the place that we have been moving through tonight. The coming of dawn in the outback is not a sudden thing. It begins as a change in the darkness, a lightening of the eastern horizon that is so gradual and so incremental that you cannot point to a moment when it starts. The stars in the east begin to lose their sharpest definition first, the sky behind them becoming blue rather than black at the limit of the perceptible, and this blue spreads upward very slowly as the Earth rotates and brings your particular patch of outback toward the terminator, the line on the planet's surface that divides the day side from the night side. The Milky Way does not go away suddenly. It fades, the more distant and fainter stars losing themselves in the brightening sky first, the brighter stars persisting until the sky is nearly blue, and then gone, folded back into the light that the sun is producing in all directions, and that the atmosphere is scattering across the sky to make the blue that is the color of a clear day. The birds begin before it is fully light. The birds of the outback, the desert species, are often up before the sun is visible, taking advantage of the cooler temperatures of the early morning to do what they need to do before the heat of the day forces them into inactivity. The ground cuckoo shrike calls from a mulga branch. The gray-crowned babbler begins its characteristic series of territorial calls, loud and repetitive and carrying a long way in the still air. The Australian bustard, if there is one in the area, walks with its measured dignity across the plain, looking for grasshoppers in the early morning, with the air of something doing its job rather than enjoying itself. The finches gather at the water source, if there is one, drinking quickly and then dispersing, their small interactions at the water's edge the first social drama of the day. The temperature starts to rise almost immediately after sunrise in the full summer. In the cooler months, it may take an hour or more to warm appreciably after the sun comes up. But when the sun rises over the outback, it rises with an authority that makes its intentions clear. There is no tentative early morning in the Australian summer interior. The sun comes up hot and it means it. The country adjusts, the way it has been adjusting to this for millions of years. The life going to ground or into shade or into behavioral modes adapted to the heat, and the landscape settling into the long, still hours of the outback day, waiting for the relief of the evening that will come in 10 or 12 hours, when the temperature will fall and the stars will come back out, and the country will resume the business of being itself in its own time. What strikes people who first encounter the night sky of the deep outback, and what often stays with them for years afterward as one of the more significant sensory experiences of their lives, is not simply the number of stars, it is the structure of the sky. In light-polluted environments, which now includes most places in the world where people live in significant numbers, the naked eye sky consists of a few hundred to a few thousand visible stars and a barely perceptible smear of the Milky Way, if conditions are good. The stars appear as individual points scattered across a dark field, and the field itself is the visual background, the empty space between the stars. In a genuinely dark sky, this relationship inverts. The sky is not a dark field with points of light. It is a light field with dark lanes and holes in it. The Milky Way is so densely populated with stars that the combined light of billions of unresolved stars creates a diffuse glow that covers a significant fraction of the sky's area. The dark lanes of the galactic dust clouds run through this diffuse glow like rivers of darkness, creating structure in the bright field. The individual bright stars are embedded in this broader context and no longer appear as isolated points, but as the visible peaks of an underlying brightness that extends everywhere. The sky becomes a surface, a textured and three-dimensional surface with depth and variation, and in the direction of the galactic center, a concentration that draws the eye the way any center of gravity draws attention. The Aboriginal astronomical tradition that described the emu in the dark lanes of the Milky Way was describing a sky that the astronomers of this tradition actually saw and observed systematically every night for tens of thousands of years. They were not describing a sky they imagined or a sky metaphorically. They were describing the actual visual character of the actual sky over the Australian interior, which is exactly the sky we are describing here, the sky that the darkest outback locations still display in its full character, to anyone willing to be there at the right hour with the right conditions. The dark constellation is a real feature of the real sky, visible to the naked eye from a dark site, specific in its shape and its orientation and its seasonal movement across the sky. The people who named it and tracked it and used it as a calendar instrument were doing observational astronomy of the highest quality. They were just doing it in a different language and encoding the results in a different form than the tradition that eventually produced telescopes and mathematical ephemerides. Something needs to be said about the dingo. not only in the context of the dingo fence, which we have already visited, but in the broader context of what the dingo represents in the ecological and cultural history of Australia. The dingo, Canis lupus dingo, arrived in Australia approximately 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, probably brought by people from island Southeast Asia who had trade and movement connections with the northern coast of the continent. It is a domestic dog that has become wild across most of its Australian range, and it is the apex terrestrial predator of the mainland Australian ecosystem for the last several thousand years. Before the dingo arrived, the mainland had other large predators. The thylacine, which we have already discussed, was present on the mainland until approximately 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, competing with the dingo and apparently losing that competition across most of the mainland before disappearing entirely and persisting only in dingo-free Tasmania. The Tasmanian devil was present on the mainland until a similar time period. The arrival of the dingo and the subsequent disappearance of the two large marsupial carnivores from the mainland represents one of the most significant restructurings of the Australian terrestrial ecosystem in the last 10,000 years, and it happened not through any natural event, but through the introduction of a domesticated animal by human agency. The dingo has since become, in a relatively brief evolutionary and ecological timescale, one of the most important elements of the Australian outback ecosystem. It is the predator that regulates kangaroo populations and maintains the ecological conditions on the dingo side of the fence that we described earlier. It is a predator that the native fauna evolved with for 3,000 to 4,000 years, which is long enough for some behavioral adaptation in the prey species, but not long enough for the deep evolutionary accommodation that characterizes the relationship between predators and prey across millions of years. And it is a predator that Aboriginal communities have had a relationship with for the entire span of its presence in Australia, using it for hunting and for warmth on cold desert nights, and maintaining a complex set of relationships with it that varies by region and community, and that is not well captured by either the straightforward domestication of a dog or the simple presence of a wild predator. Every landscape has a story it tells in one direction, and a different story it tells in another. The outback tells the story of deep time in the direction of the geology. It tells the story of remarkable persistence in the direction of its biology. It tells the story of extraordinary intellectual and cultural achievement in the direction of its human occupation. And in the direction of the mystery, which is the direction we have been traveling tonight, it tells the story of things that do not yet have adequate explanations. Things that sit between what we know and what we suspect, between what can be proven and what can be felt. The Maori man is still there, still walking, still not saying who made him. The Gosford glyphs are still on the sandstone in the Brisbane Water National Park, still not confessing whether they are ancient or modern. The thylacine has not confirmed or denied its own extinction to anyone who has been looking for evidence of it in the Cape York scrub. The Great Artesian Basin is still pushing its 2 million-year-old water toward the surface in the mound springs of the inland. The songlines of the Arabana are still mapping the lake air country in the memory, and the ceremony of the people who carry them. The banded iron formations of the Pilbara are still recording the first breath of a planet that was learning, 2.4 billion years ago, to breathe. None of these things are going anywhere. They will be there tomorrow and next year and in 1,000 years, in whatever condition the forces of time and climate and human action have brought them to. The outback has time. It is one of the few places on Earth where time is the most abundant resource, where it accumulates in the rock and the sand and the knowledge of the country in quantities that exceed any human capacity to use it all. What we can do is come to it with attention, with respect, with the willingness to sit in the strangeness and let it work on us rather than immediately trying to resolve it into something smaller and more manageable. The strangeness of the outback is not a problem to be solved. It is the character of a very old and very particular place, and that character is what we have been sitting with tonight. There is a particular kind of knowledge that can only be produced by staying in one place for a very long time. Not staying in the sense of simply remaining stationary, but staying in the sense of continuing to pay attention across generations, continuing to observe and to note and to remember and to transmit, so that the knowledge of each generation is not lost, but added to the knowledge of the previous generation and passed forward to the next. This is how the Aboriginal peoples of Australia came to know what they know about the country they have inhabited for 65,000 years. Not by any single act of observation or discovery, but by the accumulated attention of more human generations than any other continuous cultural tradition on Earth. Consider what 65,000 years of sustained observation means in practical terms. Consider the number of generations. at the conservative estimate of 20 to 25 years per generation, which is the average age at reproduction for hunter-gatherer populations, rather than the interval to full adulthood. 65,000 years represents approximately 2,600 to 3,250 generations. That is 2,600 to 3,250 unbroken transmissions of knowledge from parent to child, each transmission carrying the accumulated observations of all the generations before it, and adding the observations of the current generation to the total. No other cultural tradition anywhere in the world has maintained this unbroken chain of transmission for this length of time in the same geographic location. The geological record of the continent, which stretches back billions of years, is matched in its continuity for the period of human occupation by the cultural and knowledge record maintained by the peoples who have inhabited it. What does this produce? It produces knowledge of the kind that only time can generate. Knowledge of the long-term patterns of climate and ecology that operate on timescales of decades and centuries. Knowledge of the behavior of landscapes across full drought cycles and full flood cycles, and the long-term oscillations of rainfall that no individual human lifetime spans. Knowledge of the geological and astronomical processes that manifest slowly enough that their patterns are only visible across many human lifetimes of observation. It produces, in other words, a kind of scientific knowledge that the Western tradition has only recently begun to develop the tools to generate through the use of long instrumental records and statistical analysis of historical data. The Aboriginal tradition produced it through the only method that was available: continuous, multi-generational, accumulated observation, maintained in forms that resist the kinds of disruption that destroy written records and institutional memories. The fact that this knowledge is encoded in oral tradition, in story, in song, and ceremony rather than in writing, has led to its consistent underestimation by the Western tradition, which has tended to treat the absence of writing as the absence of intellectual seriousness. This is a category error of the first order. The forms of encoding that oral cultures use are not simpler versions of writing. They are different technologies for storing and transmitting information, with different strengths and different limitations. The narrative structure of oral knowledge makes it resistant to the kind of corruption that affects written records. A story that stops making sense when a word is changed is self-correcting in a way that a text that can be silently altered is not. The ceremonial context in which oral knowledge is transmitted creates redundancy and verification mechanisms that ensure the knowledge is being transmitted correctly. The distribution of knowledge across many individuals in a community means that no single loss is catastrophic. These are robust information management strategies, not primitive ones. The light that arrives at your eyes from distant stars is not current information about those stars. It is historical information, delayed by the time it took the light to travel from its source to your eye. A delay measured in years for nearby stars, and in thousands of years for stars in the Milky Way, and in millions of years for the nearest external galaxies visible to the naked eye. When you look at the stars from the Outback, you are not seeing the stars as they are. You are seeing a layered archive of the past, with each distance corresponding to a different depth in time. The nearby stars you see are as they were a few years ago. The stars in the Andromeda Galaxy, just visible to the naked eye from a dark site, are as they were 2.5 million years ago, when the first members of the genus Homo were beginning to make their appearance in the fossil record of Africa, when the ancestors of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia and the ancestors of every other human being alive today were a species that had not yet developed the cognitive capacity to build the traditions that their descendants would eventually carry to every habitable continent on Earth. The light from Andromeda that reaches your eye in the Outback tonight is photons that left their source 2.5 million years ago, when your entire lineage of genus Homo was just beginning. Those photons have been traveling across the intergalactic medium ever since, through the gravitational lensing of the local group, through the absorption and re-emission of the interstellar medium, finally entering the atmosphere of Earth and making their way down to a dark site in the Australian interior, where they arrive at the retina of a person who, if conditions are good, and if that person has some practice at dark sky observing, can detect them with the naked eye as a faint smear of light in the constellation of Pisces. The duration of that photon's travel exceeds the entire geological history of the human genus, and it is stopped by your eye and your visual cortex and your awareness, which is the most recent thing it has encountered in all that time. This is what the Outback does to you if you let it. It puts you in proportion, it shows you your own scale, not as an abstract number to be dismissed or overwhelmed by, but as a lived experience of smallness in time and space that is not diminishing but clarifying. The world is much larger than the human portion of it. The time it has existed is much longer than the time we have been here. The strangeness and the beauty and the deep complexity of the things that happened here before us and the things that will happen here after us do not diminish what we do or what we know or who we are. They frame it. They put it in a context that is, if you are willing to sit with it, one of the more honest and more sustaining contexts available. The Outback is honest about scale. It does not pretend that human beings are the primary actors in its story. We are recent participants in a narrative that began billions of years before we arrived, and we are beginning to understand enough of that narrative to recognize how extraordinary it is. The 65,000 years of human presence in Australia is a remarkable contribution to the story. The 10,000 years of recorded history that the Western tradition has built its sense of normalcy on is a very small chapter in the same book. The Outback knows this, and it shows it, and it asks in the most patient and unhurried way whether you know it too. In the places where the Outback is most remote, in the country beyond the last station and the last bore and the last track that appears on any current map, there are still things that no one from outside has seen, not in a mystical sense, not hidden by intention or by supernatural protection. Simply unseen because the country is very large, and the number of eyes that have moved through it in the period during which the kind of observation that would constitute seeing in the relevant sense has been possible is very small. The Aboriginal peoples who have traditional knowledge of the deep interior have seen it in the sense that they have moved through it and named it and understood it within their own knowledge framework. But systematic scientific survey, the kind of observation that would add this country to the database of formally documented geological and biological and archaeological knowledge, has not covered most of this country, and in some areas has not covered any of it. There are cave systems under the Nullarbor whose passages have not been traversed by any diver or caver carrying a recording instrument. There are sections of the Great Artesian Basin whose hydrogeology has not been mapped. There are rock faces in the remote Kimberley and in the Western Desert, whose art has not been photographed or described. There are biological populations in the remote interior, whose existence is known from occasional sightings and from the records of people who know the country, but whose formal scientific documentation remains incomplete. There is geological structure in the deep interior of the continent that has been inferred from geophysical survey, but has not been confirmed by drilling or by outcrop mapping. The Outback is not fully known. It is not even close to fully known. What we have described tonight is what is known, and what is known is extraordinary. What remains unknown is, by definition, beyond description, but it is there. This is one of the more unusual qualities of the Australian interior in the contemporary world, where most of the Earth's surface has been surveyed to some degree, mapped, described, photographed from satellites and from aircraft, covered with a sufficiently fine mesh of observation that the possibility of significant undiscovered things is generally regarded as low. The Outback defies this expectation. It is one of the last large regions on the inhabited surface of the Earth where the possibility of significant discovery remains genuinely open. Not discovery of things hidden or protected, but discovery of things that are simply there, in a landscape that is too large and too remote and too demanding to have been fully examined by the relatively small number of people who have tried. The Bungle Bungles were not discovered in 1983. They were observed in 1983 by a film crew who reported them to institutions that then entered them into formal records. They had been there, known to the Kija people, for tens of thousands of years. The formal Western scientific discovery was not the first discovery, it was the most recent. There will be more recent discoveries. The Outback will continue to give up its inventory in pieces as the technology of survey improves, as collaboration between Western scientific institutions and the Aboriginal communities who hold deep knowledge of the country deepens and becomes more genuinely reciprocal, as the patience required to stay with a landscape long enough to understand it is practiced by more people in more disciplines. What those discoveries will be, what they will add to the catalogue of strange and ancient and unexplained things in the Australian interior, cannot be predicted. But the history of discovery in this landscape, from the megafaunal sites to the opal fossils to the Bungle Bungles to the Wurdi Astronomical Observatory, suggests that the next significant discovery will be as surprising as all the previous ones, and that it will require the same combination of careful looking and honest listening that every other significant discovery has required. The country is not just old, it is also, in ways that have become more rather than less apparent as ecological research has advanced, extraordinarily complex. The simplicity that the Outback presents on the surface, the flat red plain, the sparse vegetation, the wide sky, is the simplicity of a system that has been refined over millions of years to operate within very tight constraints. to extract maximum productivity from minimum rainfall, to maintain biological diversity and ecological function under conditions that are among the most challenging for life anywhere on the inhabited surface of the Earth. The apparent simplicity is the achieved result of enormous complexity operating at scales and speeds that are not immediately visible. The soil of the outback, for example, which looks like dust and behaves like dust and smells like dust, is not simply mineral material. It is a biological system of considerable sophistication. The biological soil crust that forms on the surface of undisturbed arid and semi-arid soils, made up of cyanobacteria, algae, fungi, mosses, and lichens, is one of the most important ecological components of arid ecosystem function, fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere, stabilizing the soil surface against wind and water erosion, facilitating water infiltration, and providing the biological foundation on which the plant and animal communities of the surface are built. This biological crust is fragile. It can be destroyed by a single vehicle crossing, by the repeated passage of stock animals, by any physical disturbance of the surface. And once destroyed, it recovers very slowly, on timescales of decades to centuries. The spinifex grass that dominates so much of the sandy desert areas of Australia is not a simple ground cover. It is an engineering species that builds and maintains complex physical structures. The hummocks that dot the sandy desert surface in millions of repetitions across millions of square kilometers. Each hummock is a living ring of spinifex around a dead center, constantly expanding outward as the outer edge grows and the inner core dies, creating circular structures that can reach several meters in diameter after decades of growth. The spaces between the hummocks and within them provide habitat for a very large number of smaller organisms. The chemical defenses of the spinifex, which are substantial and include compounds that make the grass essentially inedible to most grazers, have shaped the evolution of the insects and other invertebrates that have found ways around those defenses, creating a set of highly specialized ecological relationships that are found only in spinifex habitat and nowhere else on Earth. The mulga woodlands of the drier inland, dominated by the mulga acacia and supporting a distinctive community of birds, reptiles, and small mammals, have their own ecological architecture, their own complexity of relationship and process and adaptation that has been building since the genus Acacia diversified across the Australian interior in the Miocene, and the landscapes of the inland began to take on their current general character. Mulga is not simply a tree. It is a water harvesting system, its branches arranged to direct rainfall toward the root zone, its leaf chemistry managing the balance between photosynthesis and water loss in conditions of extreme aridity. It is a nurse plant, providing the shade and the modified soil chemistry under which a range of other plant species can establish themselves. It is a food source and a nesting structure for an extensive community of animals. The mulga woodland is an ecological machine that has been running and refining itself for millions of years, and what looks from the road like a sparse scrub of grey-green trees is, on close examination, one of the more sophisticated biological systems on the continent. All of this is what the outback actually is, underneath the image of emptiness and harshness that it presents to those who pass through it quickly and at the wrong temperature. The mysteries we have been visiting tonight are not anomalies in an otherwise empty landscape. They are concentrations of the strangeness and the depth that is present throughout this country, the peaks of an underlying complexity that extends in all directions from every point in the interior. The outback is strange from edge to edge. The things we have described tonight are simply the strangest of the strange, the most visible peaks of a topography of mystery that reaches all the way to the horizon and beyond. The water of the Australian interior is worth dwelling on a little longer because it is one of the central facts of the outback, and one of the things that the knowledge traditions of the Aboriginal peoples have addressed with the most systematic and precise attention. Water in the outback is not where it appears to be. This is the first and most important lesson. It is not primarily on the surface, where rainfall would deposit it if rainfall were more frequent and more reliable. It is underground, in aquifers, and in the deeper rock structures of the continent's geological basement, and it is in places that you would not find without knowledge. In specific dry creek beds, where the alluvial gravels hold moisture long after the visible water has evaporated, in the roots of specific plant species that indicate the presence of near-surface groundwater, in the specific orientations and contours of the landscape that cause rainfall to concentrate in certain low points that can be dug to find what is percolated below the surface. The Aboriginal peoples of the interior carry this knowledge with a specificity and a reliability that have been the difference between life and death for the communities that depend on it. It is not general knowledge of the type there is water in this region. It is specific knowledge of the type there is water if you dig at the base of this particular rock formation on the north side, at the depth of about arm's length. This specificity was achieved by the kind of sustained observation across generations that we have been describing, by the systematic testing and verification of specific locations across specific climatic conditions, by the integration of ecological indicators with direct observation of water presence to build a map of the underground water resources of a region that covers thousands of square kilometers and that changes in its water availability in ways that are correlated with rainfall patterns that themselves operate on cycles of years to decades. The water knowledge is embedded in the songlines, as we have noted. The specific water holes, both permanent and temporary, are named and located and described in the songs that map the country. And the songs carry information about what the water hole looks like, and what conditions indicate whether it has water, and how deep you need to dig, and what the water tastes like. The mineral content of the water varying enough between locations in the outback that experienced travelers could identify a water hole from the taste of its water as reliably as from its visual appearance. This is detailed, practical, scientific knowledge. It is the kind of knowledge that a hydrogeologist with good survey data and years of fieldwork would be pleased to have about a region. The Aboriginal peoples of the interior have it for their country across timescales of millennia, maintained in forms that survived every disruption except the most systematic and intentional colonial efforts to break them. The mound springs of the Great Artesian Basin, where the 2 million-year-old water rises without pumping through the fault lines in the basin's geology, were the stops on the songline routes that crossed the interior of South Australia. They were the meeting points where communities from different directions of country could come together because the springs were reliable in a landscape where reliability was rare. They were the places where the water from the deep time of the Pleistocene met the surface of the Holocene, and the people who gathered at them were drawing on a resource that had been accumulating since before their species evolved. The springs themselves, with their endemic communities of organisms evolved in isolation in the specific chemical environment of each spring system, are the biological expression of that same deep time. Life adapted to conditions that began 2 million years ago and have been maintained without interruption ever since. The concept of deep time is one that geology introduced to Western thought in the 18th and 19th centuries, and that Western thought has continued to find difficult to truly assimilate at an experiential rather than merely intellectual level. The numbers involved exceed the intuitive capacities of a mind evolved to track time across the scale of human lifespans. 1 million years is a unit that has no real emotional content for most people. It is a number, an abstraction, something to be multiplied and divided in calculations, but not something to be felt in the body as a span of time. The geological record that documents the history of the Earth across 4.5 billion years is the most complete account we have of that history, and it is inaccessible to direct experience because no individual human life spans a fraction of the relevant timescales. The Australian Outback offers something that may be as close as any location on Earth to the experience of deep time. Not because the timescales become comprehensible, but because the evidence of those timescales is so densely distributed across the accessible landscape that the inadequacy of human time intuition is repeatedly and insistently demonstrated. Standing in a Corrigini gorge and touching the Banded Iron Formation, knowing that the rock formed 2.5 billion years ago from chemistry driven by microorganisms in a Precambrian ocean, does not make 2.5 billion years comprehensible. It demonstrates the incomprehensibility of that span with a physical directness that abstract knowledge of the number cannot achieve. You're touching something 2.5 billion years old. You cannot feel that. But you can feel the gap between what you know and what you can feel. And that gap is itself informative. It is the gap between human scale and geological scale. And it is one of the most important things the Outback has to offer. The Aboriginal peoples who have inhabited this landscape for 65,000 years have found ways of relating to its deep time that do not require comprehension of the absolute numbers. The dreaming is not a chronological concept. It does not locate events in a timeline measured in years or centuries or millennia. It locates them in a dimension of time that is simultaneous with the present, always accessible through the right practice and the right knowledge, rather than receding into an inaccessible past as historical time does. The ancestral events of the dreaming are not things that happened a long time ago and are therefore relevant only to the understanding of history. They are things that are still happening. Their effects and their significance and their law still operative in the present landscape, still shaping the conditions of life for the communities that know them. This is not a pre-scientific confusion of past and present. It is a different and arguably more sophisticated way of relating to the temporal depth of the landscape, one that treats the deep time of geology and cosmology as a living presence rather than a dead archive. The rock is not the record of something that used to be true. The rock is the ongoing presence of what it has always been. The water of the Great Artesian Basin is not the archive of Pleistocene rainfall. It is Pleistocene rainfall, still moving through the rock, still arriving at the surface, still available. The banded iron formations of the Pilbara are not the memorial of the Great Oxygenation event. They are the event, preserved and present, available to any hand that reaches out and touches them. The Outback relates to time differently from the way that the Western tradition has trained most of its practitioners to relate to it. It holds the past present, and that holding is one of the things that makes the Outback, for those who spend time in it with the right kind of attention, one of the more unusual and one of the more valuable places on the surface of the earth. There are places in the Outback where the convergence of different kinds of time is visible in a single location. The Flinders Ranges contain the Ediacaran fossil beds, where the first complex animals are preserved in rock 550 million years old, and they also contain the oldest continuously maintained human ceremonial relationship with a landscape in South Australia. And they also contain the geological evidence of mountain building events from the Precambrian that makes their rocks among the most structurally complex in Australia. And they also contain the Aboriginal rock art at Mudawinchi and elsewhere that spans thousands of years of continuous occupation. All of this is present in the same landscape, accessible by the same road, visible to the same eyes. The 550 million year old fossils and the 1,000-year-old rock art and the 65,000-year-old human presence and the 1.5 billion year old basement rock all share the same afternoon light. This is the peculiar quality of the Outback that makes it unlike most other landscapes. Not just that it is old, but that different registers of oldness are available simultaneously. You do not have to choose between looking at the geological and looking at the cultural and looking at the ecological. They are all present in the same view, layered together in ways that require only attention to perceive. The challenge is not finding the different layers. The challenge is slowing down enough to see them all rather than just the one you arrived looking for. This slowness is what the best Outback travel involves, not the drive-by, the tick box, the Instagram stop at the famous formation before moving on to the next one. The sustained presence, the willingness to sit with a place across an arc of light from early morning to late afternoon, and let the different registers of its character appear at their own pace. The early morning is different from the noon, and the noon is different from the late afternoon, and the late afternoon is different from the dusk, and the dusk is different from the night, and the night is different in each of its hours. The Outback reveals itself across time, across the arc of the day, and across the arc of the season, and across the arc of the year. And the revelation is not a single thing, but an accumulation that builds with each additional period of attention. The Aboriginal peoples who have maintained their knowledge of this country across 65,000 years did not do it by visiting occasionally and looking at the highlights. They did it by living here, by being here across the full range of conditions the country produces, by attending to it in its daily and seasonal and decadal variations, across a span of generations that makes the whole history of Western civilization look like an afternoon visit. This is what sustained attention to a place over deep time produces. It produces the kind of knowledge we have been describing tonight. Comprehensive, precise, practical, culturally encoded, and available to the communities that have maintained it against all the pressures that have tried, in the past 2 centuries, to disrupt and replace it. And now we come to the end, not of the Outback, which has no end accessible to any single night's attention, not of the mysteries, which are not exhausted by any number of lists or any number of hours of looking, but of tonight's particular journey, which has covered 55 items and many thousands of words of movement through a landscape that is stranger and older and more full of significance than any single visit can contain. What remains of tonight's journey is what always remains of a good journey. The residue of attention, the things that have settled into you that were not there before you started. The questions that are now more interesting than they were because you know enough to appreciate how interesting they are. The Maree Man and his silence. the Wangina and their gaze across 17,000 years, the opalized dinosaurs of Lightning Ridge waiting in the rock for someone who knows what they are looking at, the 2 million-year-old water arriving at the surface in the mound springs of the Lake Eyre Basin, having traveled through stone in the dark for longer than our species has existed, the singing dunes of the Simpson Desert and the banded iron formations of the Pilbara, and the dinosaur stampede frozen in the sandstone near Winton, and the night sky over the red center that shows the galaxy as a structure, dense and intricate and so much larger than the small point of consciousness below it, that scale itself becomes the message. Take these things with you. Let them sit in your mind in the way that the best things sit in the mind, loosely available to be returned to, not pinned and classified but present, adding their weight to the understanding of what the world is and how old it is and how strange it is, and how much of it remains beyond what we currently know. The Outback is waiting. It has no urgency about the waiting. It is very good at waiting. It has been waiting for much longer than you have been here, and it will be waiting for much longer than you will be here. And in that span of waiting, it will produce more things worth attending to than any one attention span can cover. Go slowly, go carefully. Listen to the people who know this country best. And wherever you are tonight, let the red dust of the Australian interior settle in your mind, and let the desert dark take you into whatever comes next. Sleep well. We are nearly at the end of tonight's journey through the Australian Outback. Before we close, let us take a final slow pass through a few more of the things that the Outback holds in its red heart. Things that did not find their place in the numbered list, but that belong here in the quiet of the final hour, in this space between the last item and the moment when you drift entirely into whatever comes after the last word. The opal, which we have visited in its commercial and its paleontological dimensions, deserves a moment of pure description before we leave it. An opal in your hand is a piece of the sky caught in a stone. The spectral fire of a fine, precious opal shifts as you turn it, the colors appearing and disappearing in a sequence that depends on the geometry of the diffraction, the angle at which the light enters, the angle at which your eye receives the diffracted light, the wavelength selectivity of the silica sphere arrays in the particular zone of stone that light is currently traversing. A deep red flash can disappear entirely as the stone is turned a few degrees, replaced by a green that deepens to teal and then shifts to a blue, all in the same stone, all from the same source of light, all produced by the same physical mechanism operating at scales of a few hundred nanometers, in a stone that has been carrying those nanoscale structures in its mineral matrix for 100 million years. This is what the inland sea left behind in its beds of silica-rich mud. When it withdrew and left the continent to dry into the landscape it has been ever since. It left the chemical conditions for the formation of opal, slowly, over millions of years, in the voids and replacement sites of the ancient sediment. And then it left the organisms that died in and around it, whose physical forms were preserved in the silica as the silica itself transformed into precious stone. The opal is the sea's gift to the land it used to be, a gift that takes the form of trapped light, of colors that did not exist in the Cretaceous, but that the Cretaceous chemistry made possible for the people who came much later to find. The quality of the light in the Outback has been mentioned several times in this journey and deserves explicit attention because it is one of the primary sensory experiences of the place, and one of the things that most distinguishes it from other landscapes. The light of the Outback is clear in a way that the light of humid environments is not. There is very little water vapor in the atmosphere above the Australian interior during most of the year, and water vapor is the primary diffuser and softener of sunlight in most climates. In the Outback, without that diffusion, the light arrives at the surface at full intensity, hard-edged and brilliant, making shadows sharp and colors saturated, and distances deceptively foreshortened by the absence of the atmospheric haze that normally interposes between the eye and the distant view. This clarity has consequences. Colors that would be muted by atmospheric moisture are vivid. Red is very red. Ochre is very ochre. The blue of the sky is a blue with no gray in it, saturated from horizon to zenith in a way that skies near the ocean rarely achieve. The shadows are black rather than blue, because there is not enough scattered light in the atmosphere to fill the shadows with the diffuse blue that shadow areas receive in moister climates. And at dawn and dusk, when the light is angled through the maximum thickness of atmosphere at the horizon, the colors the atmosphere produces are intense and varied. The pinks and oranges and crimsons of a central Australian sunset have nothing to do with pollution, and everything to do with the low humidity atmosphere that scatters the longer wavelengths of light when the sun is at its lowest angle. The Outback sky is a color instrument of extraordinary range, and it plays its full range twice a day. There is the matter of scale again, which the Outback returns to insistently. Not just the scale of time and of geological feature, which we have dwelt on at length, the scale of space. The distances in the outback are real in a way that map distances are not. 100 kilometers on a map is an abstraction, a number. 100 kilometers in the outback is a concrete experience of sustained forward motion through landscape that changes imperceptibly, where the mulga that is beside you now is essentially the same as the mulga that was beside you 50 kilometers ago, and will be essentially the same as the mulga that will be beside you 50 kilometers hence. And the sameness of the landscape makes the distance into something that presses against the consciousness with a weight that cartographic abstraction does not prepare you for. But this sameness is not actual sameness. It is apparent sameness, the sameness of a landscape whose variation is expressed at scales smaller than the traveling observer's frame of reference. The individual mulga tree differs from every other mulga tree in its precise branching structure, its specific relationship to the soil moisture in its immediate root zone, the particular community of insects and birds and fungi that it supports. The specific patch of soil under a specific hummock of spinifex differs in its biology from every other patch of soil under every other hummock. A world of microbial and invertebrate community structure that has been developing in those specific conditions for years or decades, producing a local ecology of enormous complexity in a space you could cover with a hat. The sameness of the outback is the sameness of the ocean, which is also not actually the same water or the same ecosystem at every point, but presents a visual uniformity that conceals the richness of variation below the surface. The outback rewards the observer who stops and looks closely much more generously than it rewards the observer who moves through it at speed and notes only the major features. This is why the Aboriginal knowledge of the country is so deep and so particular. It is the knowledge of people who stopped everywhere, who looked closely at everything, who over many generations built up a description of the country at every scale, from the individual plant and rock and waterhole, to the broad patterns of climate and ecology and geology that give the country its general character. The knowledge is fractal, detailed at every scale, each level of magnification revealing a different and equally rich level of structure and significance. The country is not simple. The knowledge is not simple, and the journey through it, whether physical or imagined, repays every additional minute of attention with additional layers of what is there to be seen. The outback will outlast us. It has outlasted everything that has tried to simplify it or dismiss it or extract only one dimension of its value. It has outlasted the inland sea that covered it 100 million years ago, and the glaciations that affected its climate without touching its essential character, and the megafaunal extinctions that changed its ecology, and the European settlement that disrupted its cultural continuity, and the mining operations that have transformed parts of its surface. It is still there. The red rock is still red. The sky is still enormous. The stars are still uncountable from the right dark place at the right hour of the night. The bilby is still digging its spiral burrow in the right kind of soil. The songlines are still mapping the country in the memory of the people who carry them. What we know about the outback is extraordinary. What we do not know about it is larger. What remains to be learned, in collaboration between the knowledge traditions that have been present in the interior for 65,000 years, and the traditions of inquiry that have arrived more recently and that have their own tools and their own strengths, is probably the most interesting body of knowledge that the Australian continent still has to offer. And the landscape itself, patient and ancient and persistently strange, will provide whatever time is needed for that learning to proceed. That is the outback. That is tonight. And now it is time to sleep. The red dust settles. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. The great artesian water moves through the rock a meter or two per year, unhurried, carrying the memory of Pleistocene rain toward the surface springs where it will arrive in another 1,000 years. The Finca River rests in its 340 million year old bed and waits for rain that is still falling somewhere in the mountains to the east. The opal in the lightning ridge field glows in the darkness of the mine shaft, its colors visible only in the miner's lamp, waiting to be brought to the light. The Wandjina on the rock face of the Kimberley watches across the night with those great dark eyes that have been watching since long before you were born, and will be watching long after you're gone. Sleep well. The outback is keeping its own hours, and it will be there in the morning. The country is still out there, red and ancient and full of things we have not yet found words for, full of things that the people who know it best have had words for across 65,000 years of patient attention, full of the kind of strangeness that does not diminish with familiarity but deepens, the way the best things in any landscape deepen when you have spent enough time with them to see past the surface into the structure below. The outback is not a mystery that waits to be solved. It is a mystery that waits to be inhabited, to be moved through slowly, to be attended to with the kind of sustained and humble regard that any ancient and complex thing deserves. It has been here longer than we have. It will be here after we're done. And in the meantime, it offers everything it has to anyone patient enough to receive it. Go now, sleep now. Let the red country carry you where it carries everything eventually, into the deep and restful quiet that the Outback knows better than anywhere else on Earth. Good night from the Australian Outback. Subscribe if you want more journeys like this one. We will be here moving slowly through the world's oldest landscapes for as long as you keep listening.